the shadow of a Devon cliff, a grand costume ball at Cresswell Hall turns deadly when historian Leonard Bryce is stabbed in a mystical shrine to Astarte. Amid glittering masks and hidden passions, Miss Jane Marple unravels a web of jealousy, betrayal, and unrequited love. A locket, a secret note, and a bronze goddess hold the clues. But can she expose the killer before the shadows of Astarte claim another soul? Chapter 1. A Summons to the Coast Miss. Jane Marple sat in her neat parlour at Mead cottage, the morning sun filtering through lace curtains to illuminate the delicate china teacup at her elbow. Her knitting needles moved with rhythmic precision, crafting a pale blue shawl for a neighbour's newborn. But her attention was fixed on a letter that lay unfolded on the rosewood table. The envelope, edged with a faint gilt border, bore the crest of Cresswell Hall, a name that stirred vague memories of her youth. The letter was from Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell, a cousin so distant that Miss Marple had to trace the family tree in her mind to place her. A vivacious girl, she recalled, who had married into Devonshire wealth and seldom wrote. Lavinia's handwriting sprawled across the page, its loops and flourishes betraying a flair for the dramatic. She invited Miss Marple to a costume ball at Cresswell Hall, a grand estate perched on the rugged Devon coast. The event promised to be a spectacle, with guests garbed as figures from ancient myth, culminating in a ceremonial gathering at the estate's peculiar shrine to Astarte, a Phoenician goddess whose name Miss Marple recognized from dusty volumes of history. Lavinia described the ball as a night of enchantment, but her words carried an odd undercurrent, a plea perhaps masked by enthusiasm. "Do come, dear Jane," she wrote. "Your presence would so reassure me." Miss Marple set the letter down, her pale eyes narrowing. She was not one for lavish parties, preferring the quiet rhythms of St. Mary Mead, where village gossip provided ample puzzles to unravel. Yet something in Lavinia's tone, a tremor of unease beneath the extravagance, piqued her curiosity. She knew of Cresswell Hall's reputation, whispered even in her corner of England. The estate was said to be magnificent, but shadowed, its gardens hiding that strange idol house, a relic of some eccentric ancestor's obsession with antiquity. Rumours of its haunting aura had reached her, though she dismissed such tales as fanciful. Still, Lavinia's invitation felt less like a social courtesy and more like a call for aid. Rising from her chair, she crossed to the window, gazing at the orderly flower beds where dahlias bloomed in defiant reds and golds. Her mind turned to practicalities. The journey to Devon would be tedious, requiring a change of trains at Exeter. But the challenge of a new setting intrigued her. She thought of the guests Lavinia might assemble. Wealthy, no doubt, and likely complex, their polished manners concealing secrets as surely as her own unassuming demeanour hid her sharp intellect. A costume ball, with its masks and artifice, would be a stage for hidden motives, and Miss Marple knew well how such gatherings could unravel into chaos. She returned to her writing desk, penning a brief acceptance to Lavinia. The act felt decisive, as though she were committing to more than a weekend's visit. Her thoughts drifted to the Astarte shrine, a detail that lingered like a discordant note. Why centre a ball around such an obscure deity? Lavinia's letter had mentioned a historian among the guests, a man studying the shrine's origins. Scholars, Miss Marple mused, could be as troublesome as lovers when their passions were stirred. With her reply posted, she began preparations. Her wardrobe offered little suited to a mythical theme, but she selected a simple gown of dove-grey silk, which, with a shawl and brooch, could pass as an Athenian matron's attire. She packed her knitting, a habit that steadied her thoughts and disarmed others, and included a small volume of Herodotus, suspecting it might prove useful. As she folded her clothes into a modest suitcase, her maid, Cherry, bustled in with tea, her youthful chatter a contrast to Miss Marple's quiet resolve. "Off to a grand house, then, Miss Marple?" Cherry asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Will there be lords and ladies?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, her smile faint. "But I suspect there will be more interesting things than titles to observe." Cherry laughed, unaware of the truth in her employer's words. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind already mapping the journey ahead. The train to Devon would carry her into a world of opulence and intrigue, where the shadow of Astarte loomed. She felt a familiar prickle of anticipation, the kind that came when human nature promised to reveal its darker shades. Closing her suitcase, she glanced once more at Lavinia's letter, its final line echoing in her thoughts. "Your presence would so reassure me." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Reassurance, she knew, was often a euphemism for something far more perilous. Chapter 2. The Goddess's Sanctuary. The train from Exeter deposited Miss Jane Marple at a windswept station near the Devon coast, where a chauffeured car awaited to convey her to Cresswell Hall. As the vehicle wound along cliffs edged with gorse, the sea churned below, its waves a restless grey under a sky-threatening rain. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, peered through the window, noting the stark beauty of the landscape. The hall itself soon came into view, a Jacobean pile of weathered stone, its chimneys thrusting upward like sentinels. Beyond its formal gardens, a copse of yews hinted at something older, more secretive. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell greeted her at the entrance, her auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon, her emerald dress a touch too vibrant for the sombre day. "Jane, you darling!" she exclaimed, her embrace warm, but her eyes flickering with a nervous energy. "You've no idea how glad I am you're here." Her voice held a theatrical lilt, but Miss Marple detected strain beneath the charm. Lavinia ushered her into a vast hall adorned with tapestries, where a fire crackled against the autumn chill. After settling Miss Marple in a chintz-draped guest room, Lavinia proposed a tour of the grounds before tea. "You must see the Idle House," she insisted, her tone bright but brittle. "It's the heart of our little pageant." Miss Marple, sensing her cousin's need to perform, agreed, donning a sensible coat and scarf. They crossed the lawn, Lavinia's chatter filling the air with tales of the hall's history, though she avoided mentioning the shrine's origins. The wind carried a tang of salt as they approached a circular stone structure nestled among ancient yews, its domed roof moss-streaked and forbidding. The Idle House was smaller than Miss Marple had imagined, its walls carved with faint, sinuous patterns that suggested a script she could not decipher. Inside, a bronze statue of Astarte dominated the space, its surface pitted by time, yet its presence commanding. The goddess stood with arms outstretched, her blank eyes seeming to follow the intruder, A low plinth beneath her held wilted flowers, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp stone. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on the statue's base, where a faint seam suggested a hidden compartment, though she said nothing. Lavinia's voice grew hushed. "My late husband's ancestor built this place. Some antiquarian folly, they say. Leonard, our historian guest, claims it's older, perhaps genuinely Phoenician." Her laugh was forced. "It's perfect for the ball's theme, don't you think?" Miss Marple murmured agreement, her attention caught by a scuff mark on the floor, as though something heavy had been dragged. She filed the observation away, her expression placid. Tea was served in the drawing-room, where Lavinia introduced the other guests, each a study in contrasts. Leonard Bryce, the historian, was a man of lean frame and intense eyes, his manner courteous but distracted, as though his thoughts lingered elsewhere. His fiancée, Miriam Holt, a pianist with delicate features, clung to his arm, her smile faltering under scrutiny. Julian Drew, a playwright with a sharp jaw and sharper tongue, lounged by the fireplace, his dark eyes assessing everyone. Mrs. Cassandra Vane, an heiress draped in silk, exuded a cool elegance, her voice low and measured. Major Hugh Redfern, broad-shouldered and ruddy, filled the room with bluff anecdotes, though his laughter rang hollow. As Lavinia outlined the costume ball's mythical theme, guests to embody gods and heroes, Miss Marple observed the interplay. Leonard's hand brushed Miriam's, but she withdrew slightly, her eyes darting to Cassandra. Julian's barbed remark about pagan nonsense drew a tight smile from Lavinia. Hugh's gaze lingered on Cassandra, who ignored him, while Miriam seemed to shrink under the Major's boisterous presence. The room hummed with unspoken rivalries, and Miss Marple's fingers, resting on her knitting, itched to unravel them. Lavinia, perhaps sensing the tension, clapped her hands. "We'll gather in the idol house at midnight for a toast to Astarte. It'll be divine." Her enthusiasm met with polite murmurs, but Miss Marple noted Leonard's sudden stillness and Miriam's bitten lip. As the group dispersed to prepare for dinner, Lavinia touched Miss Marple's arm. "You'll keep an eye out, won't you, Jane? Things feel unsteady." Her voice was a whisper, and Miss Marple's nod was grave. Alone in the drawing-room, Miss Marple stood by the window, watching shadows lengthen across the gardens. The idol house loomed in her mind, its bronze goddess a silent witness to whatever. Dramas were unfolding. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where petty jealousies often hid darker truths, and suspected Cresswell Hall was no different. The ball, with its costumes and rituals, would be a masquerade in more ways than one. Tucking her knitting into her bag, she steeled herself for the evening, knowing that Astarte's sanctuary might yet reveal its secrets. Chapter 3. The Fatal Mask. The harvest moon hung low over Cresswell Hall, its amber light casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and gilding the stone turrets with an unearthly glow. Inside, the grand ballroom buzzed with anticipation, its chandeliers sparkling above a sea of costumed figures. Miss Jane Marple stood near a velvet-draped alcove, her simple Athenian gown of dove-grey silk blending into the background, her sharp eyes missing nothing. The costume ball, Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell's pièce de résistance, had drawn a glittering assembly, but beneath the laughter and clink of champagne flutes, Miss Marple sensed a current of unease, as though the very air held its breath. Lavinia, resplendent as Astarte herself, moved through the crowd like a flame, her gown of crimson and gold shimmering with embroidered serpents that coiled around her arms. A diadem of garnets crowned her auburn hair, and her smile was radiant, though Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her hands as she greeted guests. The theme of ancient myth had inspired lavish creations, nymphs in flowing silks, satyrs with gilded horns, and gods draped in faux furs and jewels. The orchestra struck up a waltz, and couples swirled across the polished floor, their masks lending an air of mystery that Miss Marple found both intriguing and disquieting. Leonard Bryce, the historian, stood out as a Sumerian king, his black velvet robe adorned with intricate beadwork that mimicked cuneiform. A heavy gold chain hung about his neck, and his lean face, framed by a false beard, bore an expression of distracted intensity, as though his thoughts were elsewhere. At his side, Miriam Holt, his fiancée, was a delicate muse, her pale blue gown diaphanous, her dark hair woven with silver ribbons. She clung to Leonard's arm, but her eyes darted nervously, and Miss Marple observed how she flinched when he spoke sharply to a passing waiter. There was fragility there, Miss Marple thought, and perhaps fear. Julian Drew, the playwright, had chosen the guise of Pan, his lean frame swathed in green velvet, a crown of ivy atop his curls, his pipe, a prop, dangled from his lips, and his sardonic smile flashed as he bantered with a group of guests. Yet Miss Marple noted how his gaze lingered on Leonard, sharp and calculating, before flicking to Miriam with something like pity. Mrs. Cassandra Vane, an heiress whose beauty was the talk of London, glided through the room as Aphrodite, her ivory silk gown clinging to her form, a pearl-encrusted fillet gleaming in her blonde hair. Her poise was impeccable, but her eyes, cool and assessing, betrayed a mind at work. Major Hugh Redfern, broad and ruddy as Ares, wore a bronze breastplate and crimson cloak, his booming laugh filling the room, though Miss Marple saw how his hand tightened on his goblet when Cassandra passed without acknowledging him. Miss Marple, her knitting tucked discreetly in a silk reticule, sipped a glass of lemonade and listened to the hum of conversation. Lavinia had promised a midnight ceremony in the Idle House, a toast to Astarte to crown the evening's revelry. The idea struck Miss Marple as theatrical, even reckless, given the shrine's unsettling aura. She recalled its bronze statue, the faint seam at its base, and the scuff mark on the stone floor, details that lingered in her mind like pieces of a puzzle. Lavinia's nervous plea to keep an eye out echoed, and Miss Marple resolved to watch closely, knowing that costumes could hide more than faces. As the clock neared 11, Lavinia clapped her hands, her voice cutting through the music. "My dears, it's time for our pilgrimage," she announced, her tone bright but strained. "To the Idle House for Astarte's blessing." The guests murmured excitedly, gathering cloaks and masks as they followed her out into the night. The air was crisp, scented with pine and sea salt, and the moon bathed the gardens in silver. Miss Marple, walking at the rear, noted the group's dynamics. Leonard strode ahead, Miriam trailing him. Julian lingered near Cassandra, his whispers drawing a faint smile from her. Hugh marched with military precision, his cloak billowing. Lavinia led the way, her crimson gown a beacon against the dark hues. The Idle House loomed ahead, its stone walls ghostly in the moonlight, the carved patterns on its surface seeming to writhe. Inside, the bronze Astarte stood sentinel, her outstretched, arms casting eerie shadows. A table had been set before her, bearing a silver chalice and a decanter of wine, flanked by flickering candles. Lavinia, her face flushed, took her place beside the statue, gesturing for the guests to form a semicircle. "Tonight," she declared, "we honour the goddess of love and war, whose eyes see all truths." Her words, meant to be grand, faltered slightly, and Miss Marple saw Leonard's jaw tighten, Miriam's hands twist together, and Hugh's eyes narrow. Leonard stepped forward, unbidden, his voice resonant. "Astarte is no mere myth," he said, his eyes gleaming. "Her cult spanned empires, and this shrine may hold secrets older than Rome." His passion was palpable, but Miss Marple caught Julian's mocking smirk and Cassandra's arched brow. Miriam's face was pale, her lips parted as though to speak, but she remained silent. Lavinia, visibly rattled, poured wine into the chalice and raised it. "To Astarte," she said, her voice unsteady. The guests echoed her, their voices an uneven chorus, and drank from their own glasses, the candlelight glinting off jewels and metal. The ceremony concluded abruptly, as though Lavinia could no longer sustain the pretense. "Back to the ballroom," she called, leading the group out. Miss Marple lingered a moment, her gaze sweeping the chamber. The chalice remained on the table, its contents untouched, and the candles had begun to gutter. She noticed a faint smudge on the statue's plinth, like a fingerprint in wax, and filed it away. As she stepped outside, the group was already scattering, some returning to the hall, others lingering in the gardens to flirt or smoke. Leonard and Miriam walked apart, their silence heavy. Julian and Cassandra stood close, their heads bent, together. Hugh strode alone, his cloak flapping like a warning. Miss Marple followed the path back, her steps slow, her mind sifting impressions. The night felt charged, as though the ritual had stirred something volatile. She was nearing the hall's terrace when a piercing scream shattered the stillness, high and raw, coming from the direction of the idol house. The music in the ballroom faltered and guests poured out, their costumes garish in the moonlight. Miss Marple quickened her pace, her heart steady despite the chaos, and joined the crowd hurrying back to the shrine. The scene inside the idol house was one of frozen horror. Leonard Bryce lay sprawled before the statue, his black velvet robe splayed, the gold chain about his neck glinting dully. A ceremonial dagger, its hilt encrusted with lapis, protruded from his chest, and a dark stain spread across his breast. His false beard had slipped, revealing a face contorted in shock, his eyes staring blankly at the goddess above. Miriam stood nearest, her muse's gown trembling as she sobbed, her hands outstretched as though to touch him, but afraid. Lavinia, her diadem askew, clutched the doorframe, her face ashen. Julian, Cassandra, and Hugh pushed through the crowd, their expressions a mix of disbelief and dread. "Who did this?" Lavinia whispered, her voice breaking. The guests murmured, some stepping back, others craning to see. Miss Marple, slipping quietly to the front, knelt beside the body, her movements precise despite her age. The dagger was one she recognized from Lavinia's collection, displayed in the hall's library. The wound was clean, suggesting a single forceful blow. She noted Leonard's hand, clenched as though grasping something now gone, and a faint scratch on his wrist, barely visible. The smudge on the plinth was still there, but the chalice had been knocked over, its wine pooling on the stone floor. Hugh's voice boomed, breaking the silence. "We need the police at once." He turned to a footman, who nodded and ran toward the hall. Cassandra's eyes were wide, but her composure held, while Julian's face was unreadable, his pipe forgotten, in his hand. Miriam's sobs grew hysterical, and Lavinia moved to comfort her, though her own hands shook. Miss Marple rose, her gaze sweeping the room. The candles had gone out, plunging the shrine into shadow, save for the moonlight streaming. Through the open door, the statue of Astarte loomed, its blank gaze seeming to mock the tragedy at its feet. Miss Marple stepped outside, where the guests were whispering, their costumes now grotesque in the context of death. She overheard fragments. "He was fine, just moments ago. Who could have done it? That dagger! It's cursed, I tell you!" She ignored the hysteria, her mind working methodically. The murder had occurred in the brief interval between the ceremony and the scream, a window of mere minutes. The idol house was isolated, but the gardens offered cover for someone to slip away and return unnoticed. She recalled the groups: dispersal, Leonard and Miriam apart, Julian with Cassandra, Hugh alone, and wondered who had lingered, who had motive. Lavinia approached, her face drawn. "Jane, this is dreadful," she said, her voice low. "You've seen such things before. Will you help?" Miss Marple nodded, her expression grave but calm. "I'll do what I can, Lavinia," she said, though her thoughts were already racing. The dagger, the smudge, the spilled chalice, the scratch on Leonard's wrist. These were threads in a tapestry she could not yet see. She glanced back at the idol house, where Leonard's body lay under Astarte's gaze, and felt a chill unrelated to the night air. The ball, with its masks and myths, had become a stage for murder, and Miss Marple knew that beneath the costumes lay truths as deadly as the blade. As the distant wail of a police siren broke the silence, Miss Marple tightened her shawl, her mind sharpening like a needle. The guests were watching each other now, suspicion replacing revelry. Leonard Bryce, historian and scholar, had met his end in a shrine to a goddess of love and war, and Miss Marple suspected that both passions had played their part. The night was far from over, and the secrets of Cresswell Hall were only beginning to unravel. Chapter 4. The Inspector's Arrival. The moon had dipped behind a veil of clouds by the time the police arrived at Cresswell Hall, their siren's wail cutting through the stunned silence that had settled over the guests. Miss Jane Marple stood just outside the idol house, her grey shawl drawn tightly against the night's chill, her keen eyes observing the flurry of activity. The costume ball, so recently a whirl of music and colour, now felt like a grotesque charade, its participants unmasked by the stark reality of Leonard Bryce's murder. The bronze statue of Astarte loomed within the stone shrine, its presence a silent rebuke to the chaos below. Inspector Craddock, a lean man with a weathered face and a reputation for dogged precision, stepped from the police car, his overcoat flapping as he surveyed the scene. Miss Marple knew him from a case in St. Mary Mead years prior, where his methodical approach had been tempered by a willingness to heed her insights. He nodded to her now, a flicker of recognition in his grey, eyes before turning to the constable who had secured the idol house. "Keep everyone back," Craddock ordered, his voice clipped. And no one leaves the estate until I say so." The guests, their mythical costumes now incongruous, huddled on the lawn, whispering and casting furtive glances. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell, her Astarte gown dimmed by moonlight, wrung her hands, her earlier vivacity replaced by pallor. Miriam Holt, Leonard's fiancée, sat on a garden bench, her muse's ribbons trailing in the grass, her sobs muffled by a handkerchief. Julian Drew, the playwright, leaned against a yew tree, his Pan's pipe dangling from his fingers, his face a mask of studied detachment. Mrs. Cassandra Vane, the heiress, stood apart, her Aphrodite silks pristine, her expression one of cool curiosity rather than shock. Major Hugh Redfern, his Aries breastplate glinting, paced restlessly, muttering about the need for action. Miss Marple, unobtrusive in her Athenian gown, slipped closer to the idol house as Craddock entered, her reticule clutched in one hand. She had no official role, but Lavinia's whispered plea, "Jane, will you help?" had sealed her involvement. The inspector, she knew, would tolerate her presence if she remained discreet. Inside, the scene was unchanged. Leonard Bryce lay sprawled before the statue, the lapis-encrusted dagger buried in his chest, his Sumerian robe soaked with blood. The spilled chalice lay on its side, wine pooling on the stone floor, and the candles, extinguished, left the shrine in shadow, save for the police lanterns now casting harsh beams. Craddock knelt beside the body, his gloved, hands careful as he examined the dagger. "No prints, I'd wager," he murmured to the constable, who nodded. "Wiped clean, or the killer wore gloves." He glanced at the chalice, then at the statue, his brow furrowing. Miss Marple, hovering near the doorway, noted his attention to the smudge on the plinth, the one she had seen earlier, like wax pressed by a thumb. She also observed the scratch on Leonard's wrist, a thin red line barely visible under the lantern's glare, and the way his fingers curled, as though clutching something lost. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, rising and turning to her, his tone neutral but not unkind. "You're here as ever, where trouble brews. Mrs. Cresswell says you've a knack for these things. Care to share your thoughts?" Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint, self-deprecating smile. "I'm only an old woman, Inspector, with too much time to notice what others miss. But this," she gestured to the shrine, "is a puzzle, isn't it? The dagger is from Lavinia's collection, I believe, kept in the library. And the murder happened so quickly, between the ceremony and the scream. Whoever did this was bold or desperate." Craddock's eyes narrowed, but he nodded. "Bold, yes. The guests were scattered, but not far. Someone slipped in, struck, and vanished. We'll need statements from everyone." He turned to the constable. "Get Dr. Willis here for the body, and seal this place off. No one touches anything." Miss Marple stepped back as the police began their work, her mind sifting details. The dagger's origin was significant. It suggested either an impulsive act or a calculated one, using a weapon at hand. The smudge on the plinth intrigued her, perhaps a trace of the killer's presence. The chalice, knocked over, might indicate a struggle, though Leonard's body showed no other signs of resistance beyond the scratch. She recalled the guests' positions after the ceremony. Leonard and Miriam apart, Julian with Cassandra, Hugh alone. The gardens, with their shadows, offered cover, but the timing was tight. Craddock gathered the guests in the drawing-room, where a fire had been lit to ward off the night's damp. The chandeliers cast a soft glow, but the atmosphere was heavy, the costumes now a mockery of festivity. Lavinia perched on a settee, her diadem removed, her hands twisting a silk scarf. Miriam, her face blotched with tears, sat beside her, clutching Lavinia's arm. Julian sprawled in an armchair, his ivy crown askew, while Cassandra stood by a window, her silhouette statuesque. Hugh paced before the hearth, his cloak discarded, his breastplate clanking faintly. "Right," Craddock began, his notebook open. "I need to know where each of you was from the moment you left the idol house after the toast until the scream. No omissions, please. Mrs. Cresswell, let's start with you." Lavinia's voice was unsteady. "I led the group back to the ballroom. I was on the terrace, speaking with a footman about more champagne, when I heard Miriam scream. I ran back at once. Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, as though seeking reassurance. But Miss Marple's expression remained placid, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Miriam's voice was barely a whisper. I was with Leonard at first, walking back. But he said he needed a moment alone. So I went ahead. I was near the rose garden when I realized he hadn't followed. I turned back and I found him." Her sobs resumed, and Lavinia patted her hand, though her own face was strained. Craddock's pen scratched. "You were alone, Miss Holt. No one saw you." Miriam hesitated, then nodded. Miss Marple noted the flicker of doubt in her eyes, as though she feared her words might betray her. The inspector turned to Julian, who shrugged, his tone languid. "I was with Mrs. Vane, strolling through the topiary. We were discussing the absurdity of pagan rituals. I heard the scream and followed the crowd back." His eyes met Cassandra's, and she inclined her head, confirming his account with a cool, "Precisely so, Inspector." Hugh stopped pacing, his voice gruff. "I was on my own, heading for the terrace. Wanted a cigar. I was just lighting it when the scream came. Ran straight to the shrine." His hands flexed, and Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor, as though his bluster hid unease. She also recalled the empty scabbard on his belt, sized for a dagger like the one in Leonard's chest. Craddock's questions continued, but the guests' answers were vague, their movements unverified in the chaos of the ball. He dismissed them to their rooms, ordering them to remain on the estate, and turned to Miss Marple, who had remained silent, her knitting a steady rhythm. "Well, Miss Marple, any village wisdom for me?" His tone was half-teasing, but his eyes were sharp. She set her needles down, her voice soft but precise. "It's early, Inspector, but I'd look at the dagger's path. It was taken from the library, yet no one noticed it missing during the ball. And the shrine, there's a smudge on the plinth, and the chalice was spilled. Small things, but they tell a story. People, you see, are careless when they're hurried or frightened." Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "I'll have the library checked, and the shrines being photographed. You noticed anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated, then said, "The scratch on Mr. Bryce's wrist. It's slight but fresh. Perhaps he grabbed at something or someone, and his hand was clenched, as though he held something taken from him." She did not mention the guests' tensions she had observed. Miriam's fear, Julian's calculation, Cassandra's detachment, Hugh's agitation. Those were threads she would weave privately, for now. The inspector thanked her and moved to confer with the coroner, Dr. Willis, who had arrived to examine the body. Miss Marple slipped into the hall, where Lavinia waited, her face drawn. "Jane, this is a nightmare," she whispered. "Leonard was difficult, but who would do this?" Her eyes searched Miss Marple's, and the older woman patted her hand, her touch gentle but firm. "Someone with a reason, Lavinia," Miss Marple said, "and reasons, in my experience, are never as hidden as people think." She excused herself, retiring to her room, where she sat by a small fire, her knitting resumed. The night's events replayed in her mind: the ceremony, the scattered guests, the scream, the dagger. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a stolen brooch or a poisoned pen had taught her the patterns of human nature. Cresswell Hall was grander, but its secrets were no different. The smudge, the scratch, the clenched hand, these were clues, but the guests' faces told a deeper story. Miriam's grief seemed genuine, yet her hesitation suggested fear of more than loss. Julian's alibi with Cassandra was too neat, their rapport too practised. Hugh's solitude was convenient, his scabbard troubling. Cassandra's calm was unnatural, as though she had steeled herself for tragedy. And Lavinia, her nervousness, predated the murder, hinting at foreknowledge of discord. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the idol house itself, the statue's blank gaze, the faint seam at its base, the scuff mark on the floor. These were not mere backdrop, but part of the crime's fabric. Astarte, goddess of love and war, presided over passions that could kill, and Miss Marple suspected that both had converged in Leonard's death. She rose, extinguishing the lamp, and gazed out at the darkened gardens, where the shrine stood like a sentinel. The police would do their work, but she would do hers, watching, listening, and piecing together the truth that lay beneath the masquerade. Chapter 5. Tangled Bonds. The morning after the murder at Cresswell Hall dawned grey and heavy, with mist curling over the Devon cliffs like a shroud. Inside the grand dining room, where breakfast was laid out on a mahogany sideboard, the atmosphere was as oppressive as the weather. Miss Jane Marple sat at a corner of the long table, her simple Athenian gown replaced by a tweed skirt and cardigan, her knitting bag at her feet. She sipped weak tea, her pale eyes flitting over the remaining guests, who moved through the rituals of breakfast with the stiffness of actors in a poorly rehearsed play. Leonard Bryce's death had fractured the facade of civility, and suspicion now hung over the room like the mist outside. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell, her crimson Astarte costume discarded for a sombre black dress, presided over the table with a strained smile. Her auburn hair, usually so artfully arranged, was pinned haphazardly, and her hands fidgeted with a silver butter knife. Miriam Holt, Leonard's fiancée, sat hunched over an untouched plate, her delicate features blotched from crying, her muse's ribbons replaced by a plain shawl. Julian Drew, the playwright, slouched in his chair, his sharp features accentuated by the pallor of sleeplessness, a cigarette burning between his fingers. Mrs. Cassandra Vane, the heiress, maintained, her elegance in a tailored grey suit, her blonde hair gleaming under the chandelier, though her eyes were watchful, missing nothing. Major Hugh Redfern, his military bearing undimmed, attacked a plate of kedgeree with forced gusto, but his glances toward Cassandra betrayed unease. Miss Marple, unobtrusive as ever, had declined Inspector Craddock's invitation to join his morning interviews, preferring to observe the guests in their natural setting. The inspector, she knew, would methodically collect statements, but she trusted her own method, watching the small gestures, the unguarded moments that revealed what words concealed. Her knitting needles clicked softly, a pale blue scarf taking shape, and she listened as Lavinia attempted to fill the silence with brittle small talk about the weather, only to falter under the weight of the previous night's horror. The murder in the idol house had left its mark on everyone. But Miss Marple sensed that the roots of the crime lay not in the shrine's eerie aura, but in the tangled relationships among those now seated before her. Leonard Bryce, the historian, had been a man of charm and ambition, yet his death suggested a passion turned deadly. The ceremonial dagger, the spilled chalice, the smudge on the plinth, these were clues, but the guests' behaviours were the threads she needed to weave into a pattern. She had already noted Miriam's fear, Julian's calculation, Cassandra's detachment, Hugh's agitation, and Lavinia's premonitory nervousness. Today, she resolved to probe deeper, to uncover the bonds that had led to bloodshed. Lavinia, perhaps sensing the need to assert control, cleared her throat. "I've spoken with Inspector Craddock," she said, her voice thin but determined. "He's asked us to remain here until his inquiries are complete. I know this is dreadful, but we must cooperate." Her eyes darted to Miss Marple, a silent plea for support, but Miss Marple merely nodded, her expression serene. Miriam's head jerked up, her voice tremulous. "Cooperate? When Leonard is he gone? How can we just sit here eating breakfast as if nothing's happened?" Her hands twisted the shawl, and a tear slid down her cheek. Cassandra's lips parted, as though to offer comfort, but she closed them, her face resuming its cool mask. Julian exhaled a plume of smoke, his tone dry. "Life goes on, Miss Holt, even when it's inconvenient. The police will do their job, and we'll do ours. Stay out of their way." Hugh slammed his fork down, the clatter startling everyone. "Damn it, Drew, show some respect. The man's dead, and you're puffing away like it's a West End show." His ruddy face flushed darker, and Miss Marple noted the vein pulsing at his temple. Julian's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, crushing his cigarette in a saucer. Cassandra's gaze flicked between the two men, a faint frown creasing her brow, while Lavinia looked helplessly at Miss Marple. Miss Marple set her teacup down, her voice gentle but firm. "Grief takes many forms, Major Redfern, as does shock. We're all unsettled, but perhaps we might share what we knew of Mr. Bryce. It could help the inspector." Her suggestion was innocuous, but she watched closely, knowing that such prompts often loosened tongues. Lavinia seized the opportunity, her words tumbling out. Leonard was a brilliant scholar. He'd been studying the Astarte shrine for months, convinced it held clues to a lost Phoenician settlement. He was so passionate, always talking about ancient rituals and trade routes. She paused, her fingers tightening on the butter knife. He could be intense, but he was a guest here, a friend. Miriam's voice was barely audible. He wasn't just intense. He was different lately, distracted, as if something weighed on him. I thought it was his work, but now... Her words trailed off, and she pressed the shawl to her lips, her eyes brimming. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. "Different how, my dear? Did he speak of anything troubling?" Miriam hesitated, glancing at the others, then shook her head. "He wouldn't say, but he spent hours in the library, reading old manuscripts. And he argued with someone a few days ago. I heard raised voices, but I didn't see who." Her admission hung in the air, and Miss Marple noted Julian's sudden stillness, his fingers pausing on the cigarette pack. Cassandra spoke next, her voice low and measured. "Leonard was charming, of course, but ambitious. He approached me about funding his research, promising it would make headlines. I agreed to consider it, but he grew secretive, as if he'd found something he didn't want to share." Her eyes met Miss Marple's briefly, and the older woman sensed a guardedness, as though Cassandra knew more than she revealed. Hugh snorted, his tone gruff. "Bryce was a show-off, always parading his knowledge. Thought he was better than the rest of us. I didn't trust him, especially after he outbid me for a Sumerian tablet last year. Cost me a fortune." His words were blunt, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of something deeper. Resentment, perhaps, or a wound to his pride. She recalled the empty scabbard on his costume belt, a detail that nagged at her. Julian's laugh was sharp, cutting through the tension. "Oh, come now, Major. Leonard was hardly a villain. He was a dreamer, chasing myths. But dreamers make enemies, don't they? Especially when they owe money." His eyes glinted, and Miss Marple's needles paused. The comment was casual, but it landed like a stone, and she saw Miriam's shoulders stiffen, Cassandra's head tilt, and Hugh's jaw clench. Lavinia's voice was sharp. "Julian, that's enough. Leonard was my guest, and he's dead. We don't need insinuations." Julian shrugged, lighting another cigarette, but Miss Marple filed away his words. Money, ambition, secrecy. These were motives, and Julian's barb suggested he knew more about Leonard's affairs than he let on. The breakfast ended awkwardly, the guests dispersing to their rooms or the gardens, where police constables stood. "Watch." Miss Marple lingered, offering to help Lavinia clear the table, a pretext to speak privately. As they stacked plates, Lavinia's composure cracked. "Jane, I'm at my wits' end," she whispered. "Leonard's death, it's not just a tragedy. It's as if something dark was brewing here, and I didn't see it. Did I invite this horror?" Miss Marple's hand rested on her cousin's arm, her voice steady. "You invited guests, Lavinia. Not murder, but people bring their secrets, and secrets have a way of surfacing. Tell me, did you notice anything unusual about Leonard before last night? Any quarrels? Any visitors?" Lavinia frowned, her eyes distant. "He was agitated, now that you mention it. He spent hours in the idol house, sketching the statue, muttering about its origins. And yes, he had a visitor last week. A man, rough-looking, not local. They spoke in the library, and Leonard seemed upset afterward. I didn't pry, but—" She trailed off, her fingers twisting the scarf again. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the new information. A mysterious visitor, Leonard's agitation, Miriam's hint of an argument. These were pieces of a puzzle, but the picture remained elusive. She thanked Lavinia and excused herself, deciding to walk the grounds before Craddock's next round of interviews. The mist had lifted slightly, revealing the cliffs and the sea beyond, its waves a restless murmur. She made her way to the rose garden, where she found Miriam sitting alone on a stone bench, her shawl slipping from her shoulders. "May I join you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle. Miriam nodded, her eyes red-rimmed. They sat in silence for a moment, the guhua scent of damp roses mingling with the sea air. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the click of needles a soothing counterpoint to Miriam's uneven breathing. "It's hard, losing someone you love," she said at last, "but sometimes talking helps. Did Leonard share anything with you? Anything that might explain this?" Miriam's hands clenched in her lap. "He was so wrapped up in his work. The Astarte shrine, it consumed him. He said it could rewrite history, but he wouldn't tell me how. And he was distant, as if he didn't trust me any more. I feared he was drawn to someone else." Her voice broke, and she looked away toward the sea. Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice soft. "Someone else? Did you suspect anyone in particular?" She thought of Cassandra, whose elegance had drawn Leonard's attention, and of Hugh's proprietary glances toward the heiress. Miriam shook her head, but her hesitation spoke volumes. "I saw him with Mrs. Vane in the library a few nights ago. They were whispering, and he looked guilty. I didn't confront him, but it hurt." Her words were a confession, and Miss Marple's heart ached for her, though her mind sharpened. Jealousy, she knew, was a motive as old as time, and Miriam's pain might hold a clue. They were interrupted by the crunch of gravel as Hugh approached, his face ruddy from the cold. "Miss Holt, you shouldn't be out here alone," he said, his tone paternal but edged with something sharper. "And you, Miss Marple, Craddock's looking for you. Says he's got questions about the shrine." His eyes lingered on Miriam, and Miss Marple noted the protective stance, the way his hand flexed as if to reach for her. "Thank you, Major," Miss Marple said, rising. "I'll find the inspector. Miriam, do rest, my dear." She left them, her mind buzzing. Hugh's concern for Miriam seemed genuine, but his agitation suggested more. A connection to Leonard, perhaps, or to Cassandra. She made her way to the hall where Craddock was in the library, examining the case where the dagger had been displayed. The glass door was intact, the lock unforced, suggesting someone with access had taken the weapon. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, his tone brisk, "we've confirmed the dagger came from here. No signs of theft, which means it was taken during the ball, likely by someone who knew its place. Any thoughts?" Miss Marple's eyes scanned the room, noting the manuscripts Leonard had studied, now neatly stacked. "It's curious, Inspector, that no one noticed it missing. The ball was crowded, but the library was quiet. And the smudge on the plinth, has it been analysed? It might tell us who was there." She did not mention Miriam's revelation or Hugh's behaviour, preferring to let those threads develop. Craddock nodded, jotting a note. "We're testing the smudge, and we found a hair near the body. Blonde, long. Could be Mrs. Vane's or someone else's. We'll see." His words were cautious, but Miss Marple's mind leapt to Cassandra, whose composure now seemed more significant. A blonde hair, a whispered conversation, a jealous fiancé. These were not proof, but they were steps toward truth. As she left the library, Miss Marple paused by a window, gazing at the idle house in the distance. The shrine was a stage, Astarte, its silent audience, and Leonard's death its climax. She thought of her village, where a stolen letter or a bitter feud had taught her the power of hidden bonds. Here, love, ambition, and resentment intertwined, and she suspected that the key lay not in the shrine's mysteries, but in the hearts of those who had stood beneath its gaze. Her knitting resumed, the scarf lengthening, and she resolved to watch closer, knowing that the next thread might unravel the whole. Chapter 6. The Pianist's Fear. The second day at Cresswell Hall unfolded under a sky of unrelenting grey, the mist from the Devon cliffs seeping into the very bones of the estate. Miss Jane Marple sat in the morning room, a small sunless space overlooking the sodden gardens, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet rhythm. A pale green scarf, destined for a St. Mary Mead charity, grew steadily in her lap, but her attention was fixed on the undercurrents of tension that rippled through the house. Leonard Bryce's murder in the Idle House had cast a pall over the guests, and Miss Marple, ever the observer of human nature, sensed that fear, not grief, was the dominant note in the air. The morning room, with its faded chintz armchairs and a fireplace that failed to dispel the damp, was empty save for Miss Marple and Miriam Holt, Leonard's fiancée. Miriam had sought her out after breakfast, her delicate frame swathed in a woolen dress the colour of ash, her dark hair pulled back, severely accentuating the hollows beneath her eyes. She sat across from Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly, as though to anchor herself against a tide of emotion. The pianist's fingers, usually so deft on the keys, trembled faintly, and Miss Marple, with her knack for seeing beyond surfaces, recognized a young woman teetering on the edge of collapse. The other guests were elsewhere. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell in her study, answering Inspector Craddock's questions. Julian Drew, the playwright, smoking in the conservatory. Mrs. Cassandra Vane, the heiress, writing letters in her room. And Major Hugh Redfern, pacing the terrace with the restless energy of a caged lion. Miss Marple had chosen this quiet moment to speak with Miriam, sensing that the girl's fragility might yield truths the others guarded. She had already learned of Leonard's preoccupation with the Astarte shrine, his whispered meeting with Cassandra, and the mysterious visitor to the estate. Now she sought to unravel the pianist's fear, which seemed to pulse beneath her every word. "Miss Holt," Miss Marple began, her voice soft as the patter of rain against the window, "you've had a dreadful shock, and it's no wonder you're distressed, but sometimes sharing one's burdens lightens them. Would you tell me a little more about Leonard? Not the scholar, but the man you loved." Her tone was gentle, inviting confidence, and she resumed her knitting, the click of needles a soothing counterpoint to the room's oppressive silence. Miriam's lips parted, then closed, as though the words were too heavy to speak. She glanced at the door, ensuring they were alone, then leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "I don't know where to begin, Miss Marple. Leonard was everything to me. Brilliant, kind, full of dreams. But these last months he changed. He was obsessed with the Astarte shrine, spending hours sketching it, reading old texts. He said it could prove a link between Phoenician traders and Britain. But it was more than that. It was as if the shrine possessed him." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting Miriam's. "Possessed? That's a strong word, my dear. Did he speak of anything specific? Any discovery, perhaps, or a fear? She thought of the smudge on the plinth, the spilled chalice, and the scratch on Leonard's wrist, clues that hinted at a struggle. But Miriam's words suggested a deeper turmoil. Miriam's hands twisted in her lap. He wouldn't tell me much. He said it was for my safety. But I heard him muttering once about eyes that see too much. I thought he meant the statue, but now I wonder if he meant someone watching him. He was so secretive, locking his notes in his desk, avoiding me. And then I saw him with Mrs. Vane in the library 3 nights ago. They were arguing, not loudly, but intensely. He looked angry, and she looked almost frightened. Her voice cracked, and she pressed a hand to her mouth as though to stifle a sob. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but her mind sharpened. Cassandra's elegance and composure had struck her as a shield, and this glimpse of her in conflict with Leonard was a new thread. Arguing, you say? Did you hear anything they said, even a word or two? She kept her tone light, as though asking about a village tea party, but her eyes were keen. Miriam shook her head, her dark hair falling loose. I was too far away, and I didn't want them to see me. But when Leonard left, he slammed the door, and Mrs. Vane stayed behind, staring at the fireplace. I thought perhaps they were involved. It broke my heart, Miss Marple, to think he might love her. Her voice trembled with the pain of betrayal, and Miss Marple's heart ached for her, though she noted the assumption of romance. Jealousy, she knew, could cloud judgment, but it could also illuminate truth. Love is a powerful thing, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle. It can make us see shadows where there are none. But let's think clearly. Where were you, my dear, during the ceremony in the Idol House? You said Leonard wanted to be alone, but can anyone confirm where you went? Her question was delicate but pointed, and she watched Miriam's reaction closely. Miriam's eyes widened, a flicker of panic crossing her face. I told the inspector. I was in the rose garden alone. I needed air after the ceremony. It was so stifling, with everyone pretending to be merry. I didn't see anyone until I went back and found him. Her voice broke, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. Miss Marple reached out, patting her arm, but her mind noted the hesitation, the lack of an alibi. Miriam's grief seemed genuine, but fear could masquerade as sorrow, and her solitary walk was a gap in the timeline. The door creaked open, and Lavinia entered, her black dress rustling. Her face was drawn, but she managed a smile. Jane, Miriam, I thought I'd find you here. Inspector Craddock's finished with me, and he's asking for you, Miriam. He's in the library. Her voice was kind, but her eyes darted between the two women, as though sensing the weight of their conversation. Miriam rose, smoothing her dress, her movements jerky. Thank you, Mrs. Cresswell. I'll go now. She glanced at Miss Marple, a silent plea in her eyes, then left, her footsteps echoing in the hall. Lavinia sank into the chair Miriam had vacated, her hands clasping a lace handkerchief. Poor girl, she murmured. She's shattered, isn't she? And yet, I wonder if she knows more than she says. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her voice mild. Grief can make one reticent, Lavinia. But you're right to wonder. People often hold back, not from guilt, but from fear. Tell me, did you ever see Leonard and Mrs. Vane together? in a way that suggested intimacy. She chose her words carefully, knowing Lavinia's penchant for drama might yield useful observations. Lavinia's eyes widened, then narrowed. Intimacy? Well, Leonard was a charmer, and Cassandra's a beauty, so one might assume. But no, nothing overt. They did spend time together, though, discussing his research. She was funding him, you know, and I saw them once in the garden, heads close, looking at some old map. But it seemed professional, not romantic. Still, Miriam's young, and love makes one suspicious. Her tone was speculative, and Miss Marple noted the hint of relish, as though Lavinia enjoyed the intrigue despite the tragedy. "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her smile faint. "And what of Major Redfern? He seems protective of Miriam, but I sense he's uneasy. Did he and Leonard ever clash?" She recalled Hugh's outburst at breakfast, his resentment of Leonard's arrogance, and the empty scabbard on his costume belt. Lavinia's lips pursed. Hugh didn't care for Leonard, that's true. They had words a week ago, over some auction. Leonard outbid him for an artifact, and Hugh took it personally. He's a proud man, and Leonard could be insufferable, flaunting his knowledge. But I can't imagine Hugh— well, you know. She trailed off, her handkerchief twisting tighter, and Miss Marple saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes. They were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, and Julian Drew appeared in the doorway, his sharp features softened by the dim light. "Ladies," he said, his tone mockingly formal, "I hope I'm not intruding. The conservatory's too damp for my taste, and I thought I'd seek civilized company." He sank into a chair, lighting a cigarette, his eyes glinting with amusement as he watched Lavinia's discomfort. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her voice pleasant. "Not at all, Mr. Drew. We were just speaking of poor Mr. Bryce. You knew him well, I believe. Did he ever mention anything that worried him? Debts, perhaps, or enemies?" She recalled Julian's barbed comment about Leonard owing money, a hint of knowledge that had piqued her interest. Julian exhaled a plume of smoke, his smile wry. "Leonard was a dreamer, Miss Marple, and dreamers often overreach. He did owe me a sum, nothing ruinous, but he was cagey about repaying it. Said he was waiting on a big discovery to settle his accounts. I didn't press him, but others might have." His words were casual, but his eyes flicked to Lavinia, who stiffened, and Miss Marple sensed he was testing the waters, probing for reactions. "Others?" Miss Marple asked, her tone innocent. "You mean someone here, perhaps?" She leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady, and Julian's smile faltered, though he recovered quickly. "Who knows?" he said, shrugging. "Leonard had a knack for ruffling feathers, but I'm no detective, Miss Marple. That's your game, isn't it?" His tone was teasing, but there was an edge to it, and Miss Marple's smile remained serene, giving nothing away. Lavinia rose, her voice brisk. "I must check on the staff. Jane, will you join me for tea later? Mr. Drew, do behave." She swept out, leaving a faint scent of lavender. And Julian chuckled, though his eyes followed her with calculation. Miss Marple gathered her knitting, rising with a murmured excuse. But she paused at the door. "Mr. Drew, a word of advice from an old woman. Secrets have a way of surfacing, especially in a house like this. If you know something, it's best to share it with the inspector." Her voice was mild, but her eyes were sharp, and Julian's smile faded, his cigarette pausing halfway to his lips. She left him, making her way to the library, where she hoped to examine the manuscripts Leonard had studied. The room was empty, save for a constable guarding the dagger's display case, now locked. The manuscripts, stacked neatly, bore titles in Latin and Greek, and Miss Marple, with her schoolgirl knowledge of classics, deciphered enough to see they concerned ancient trade routes. A single page, tucked beneath the pile, caught her eye, a Chiug sketch of the Astarte statue, annotated with the words "Hidden Chamber." Her heart quickened, and she slipped the page into her reticule, resolving to revisit the idol house. As she stepped into the hall, she saw Miriam returning from her interview, her face pale but composed. Their eyes met, and Miriam offered a tentative nod as though grateful for their earlier talk. Miss Marple smiled, but her mind was racing. Miriam's fear, Julian's insinuations, Lavinia's doubts, and the sketch. These were fragments of a truth that lay just out of reach. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a whispered rumour or a stolen glance had unravelled many a mystery. Cresswell Hall was grander, but its secrets were no less human. And Miss Marple knew that the pianist's fear, like the shrine's hidden chamber, held a key to the darkness that had claimed Leonard Bryce. Chapter 7. The Playwright's Cynicism. The afternoon light at Cresswell Hall was a feeble thing, filtered through thick clouds that pressed low over the Devon coast, casting the estate in a pall of muted grey. Miss Jane Marple sat in the library, a cavernous room lined with leather-bound volumes and heavy oak shelves, her knitting needles crafting a delicate lace pattern in soft lavender wool. The air smelled of old paper and polish, but the warmth of the fire did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had settled over the house since Leonard Bryce's murder. Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, had chosen this quiet corner to reflect, her sharp mind sifting through the clues and conversations of the past 2 days. The ceremonial dagger, the smudge on the plinth, the blonde hair found near the body, and the sketch of Astarte's statue with its cryptic note about a hidden chamber. These were pieces of a puzzle, but it was the human threads, woven with envy, fear, and desire, that held her attention. The library's tall windows overlooked the sodden gardens, where the idol house stood like a sentinel, its stone walls a stark contrast to the manicured hedges. Miss Marple had intended to examine the manuscripts Leonard had studied, but her solitude was interrupted by the creak of the door and the entrance of Julian Drew, the playwright, whose sharp features and sardonic air marked him as a man who thrived on observation. His dark suit was rumpled, as though he had slept in it, and his hands fidgeted with a silver cigarette case, the click of its clasp punctuating the silence. He paused, seeing Miss Marple, then offered a crooked smile, his eyes glinting with a mix of amusement and wariness. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but edged, "I find you in the heart of the mystery as usual, plotting to unmask the villain, or merely knitting for the village fate." He sank into a leather armchair opposite her, crossing one leg over the other, his posture languid but his gaze alert. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, her smile faint and disarming. "Knitting, Mr. Drew, is a great aid to thought. It keeps the hands busy while the mind wanders. And you? What brings you to the library on such a dreary day?" Her tone was polite, but her eyes, pale and piercing, missed nothing. The slight tremor in his fingers, the way his smile tightened at her question. Julian lit a cigarette, the flare of the match briefly illuminating his face. Boredom, I suppose. This house is a pressure cooker. Everyone watching everyone else, waiting for Craddock to pounce. I thought I'd find a book to distract me, but I'm more curious about you. You've a reputation, you know. The old lady who sees through lies. His words were teasing, but there was a challenge beneath them, as though testing her resolve. Miss Marple's needles paused, her voice gentle but firm. Reputations are often exaggerated, Mr. Drew. I simply notice things, small things, like the way people speak, or what they choose not to say. You, for instance, seem to know more about Mr. Bryce than you've shared with the inspector. Your remark about his debts was illuminating. She tilted her head, her gaze steady, and saw a flicker of unease cross his face before he masked it with a laugh. "Clever, Miss Marple," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. "Yes, Leonard owed me money, a few £100, nothing to kill over. He was always chasing some grand discovery, promising riches that never materialized. I lent him the cash for a dig in Syria, but he came back empty-handed, full of excuses. I wasn't the only one he owed, though. He had a habit of living beyond his means." His tone was casual, but his eyes darted to the door, as though ensuring they were alone. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their work. A habit that might make enemies, I imagine. Did he ever mention anyone pressing him for repayment? Someone less patient than you? She kept her voice light, as though discussing village gossip. But her question was a probe, and she watched his reaction closely. Julian's smile faded, his fingers tightening on the cigarette case. He was cagey about his finances, but I heard him arguing with someone on the telephone a week ago, here in the library. Couldn't make out the words, but he was furious, slamming the receiver down. Later, he told me it was a business matter. I didn't press. None of my affair. He shrugged, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes avoided hers. He was holding something back, she was certain, and she filed the incident away, alongside Miriam's tale of Leonard's argument with Cassandra. The library door opened again, and Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell entered, her black dress rustling, a tray of tea things in her hands. Her face, usually so animated, was drawn, and her eyes carried the weight of sleeplessness. "Jane, Mr. Drew, I thought you might like some tea," she said, her voice strained but warm. "This house feels like a tomb today, and I can't bear to be alone." She set the tray on a side table, her hands trembling as she poured, the china clinking faintly. Miss Marple rose to help, her movements deft despite her age. "You're very kind, Lavinia. A cup of tea is just the thing." She took the pot, allowing Lavinia to sink into a chair, and poured 3 cups, her eyes flicking to Julian, who had stubbed out his cigarette and was watching Lavinia with a curious intensity. "You've had a trying time, my dear," Miss Marple continued, handing Lavinia a cup. "Running a house under such circumstances is no small task. Have you heard anything new from Inspector Craddock?" Lavinia's fingers tightened on the aiguille. "Saucer," her voice low. "He's been thorough, searching Leonard's room, questioning the staff. He found a letter in Leonard's desk, addressed to no one, just a draft, saying he was sorry and needed to make things right. Craddock thinks it's significant, but I can't imagine what it means." Her eyes darted to Julian, then back to Miss Marple, and the older woman sensed her hostess was fishing for reactions, perhaps hoping to ease her own fears. Julian leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Oh, sorry for what? Swindling someone, or breaking a heart? Leonard was a master at both, from what I saw." His words were cruel, and Lavinia flinched, but Miss Marple's expression remained serene, though her mind seized on the letter. And that apology, vague but weighted, could point to guilt, betrayal, or even danger, perhaps the motive for his murder. "Mr. Drew," Miss Marple said, her voice mild but pointed, "you seem to have strong opinions about Mr. Bryce. Did you ever see him act in a way that suggested he feared for his safety? A man with debts and enemies might be cautious, after all." She sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving his face, and saw a muscle twitch in his jaw. Julian hesitated, then leaned back, his smile returning but strained. "Leonard was too arrogant to fear much, but I did overhear him talking to Major Redfern a few days ago in the billiard room. They were at odds, something about that auction Hugh mentioned. Leonard laughed it off, but Hugh was livid, said he'd make him pay. I thought it was just bluster, but now—" He trailed off, shrugging, and Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind turning to Hugh's empty scabbard and his protective demeanour toward Miriam. Lavinia's cup rattled in its saucer, her voice rising. "Hugh, surely you don't think, oh, this is too much. First Leonard, now accusations among my guests." She pressed a hand to her temple, and Miss Marple reached out, her touch calming. "Speculation is natural, Lavinia," she said, her voice soothing. "But we mustn't jump to conclusions. The truth has a way of surfacing, like cream in a churn. Mr. Drew, you've been most helpful. Perhaps you could tell us where you were during the ball, just to clarify things." Her question was gentle, but its steel was unmistakable. And Julian's eyes narrowed, though he complied. "I told Craddock," he said, his tone clipped. "I was with Mrs. Vane, walking through the topiary after the ceremony. We were together until the scream. Then we ran back with the others. She'll confirm it." His words were confident, but Miss Marple noted the slight emphasis on Cassandra's name as though reinforcing their alibi. She thought of the blonde hair found near the body, possibly Cassandra's, and wondered if Julian's story was as tidy as he claimed. Lavinia excused herself, murmuring about checking on the staff, and left the library, her handkerchief crumpled in her hand. Miss Marple and Julian sat in silence for a moment, the fire crackling, the rain a steady drumbeat against the windows. She resumed her knitting, her voice conversational. "You're a writer, Mr. Drew, so you understand character. What did you make of Leonard's fiancée, Miss Holt? She's terribly shaken, poor thing." Julian's eyes glinted, his tone dry. "Miriam's a delicate creature, isn't she? Devoted to Leonard, but I wonder if she knew him as well as she thought. He was a man of secrets, and secrets can break a heart like hers. I saw her watching him at the ball, before the ceremony. Such longing, but also fear. Makes you wonder what she suspected." His words were insightful, but there was a cruelty in them, as though he enjoyed dissecting others' pain. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Fear is a powerful thing, Mr. Drew. It can drive people to act in ways they never imagined. Did you ever see Miss Holt and Leonard argue, or perhaps notice her with someone else? Major Redfern, for instance." She recalled Hugh's concern. For Miriam, his anger at Julian's callousness, and wondered if the Major's feelings ran deeper. Julian's laugh was sharp. Miriam and Hugh? Now there's a thought. She's too fragile for his type, but he's been hovering over her like a guard dog since the murder. Maybe he fancies himself her protector, or maybe he's covering something. I wouldn't know. I'm just a bystander, Miss Marple, not a sleuth. His tone was mocking, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, and Miss Marple smiled undeterred. She rose, gathering her knitting, her voice gentle. Bystanders often see more than they realize, Mr. Drew. Thank you for your candor. I'm sure Inspector Craddock will appreciate it. She moved toward the door, but paused, turning back. One last thing. Did Leonard ever mention the Astarte statue itself? Perhaps something about its construction? She thought of the sketch, with its note about a hidden chamber, a detail she had not shared. Julian's brow furrowed, his cigarette pausing halfway to his lips. The statue. He was obsessed with it, always sketching, muttering about its age. Once he said it was more than it seemed, but I thought he was being dramatic. Why do you ask? His curiosity was genuine, but Miss Marple merely smiled, murmuring a vague reply before leaving the library. Outside, the rain had eased, leaving the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. Miss Marple made her way to the conservatory, where she found a quiet corner to reflect. Julian's cynicism, she mused, was a shield, but his knowledge of Leonard's debts, his overhearing of arguments, and his guardedness suggested he was more entangled than he admitted. The letter in Leonard's desk, the telephone quarrel, Hugh's threat, these were new threads, and they pointed to motives beyond jealousy. She thought of Miriam's fear, Cassandra's composure, and Hugh's bluster, each a piece of the human mosaic that had culminated in murder. Miss Marple's fingers traced the sketch in her reticule, the words, hidden chamber, a whisper of possibility. The idol house was more than a stage for death. It held secrets of its own, and Leonard's obsession with it might have been his undoing. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a hidden diary or an overheard whisper had unravelled many a crime. Cresswell Hall was grander, but its dramas were no less intimate, and Miss Marple knew that the playwright's cynicism, like the statue's blank gaze, concealed a truth waiting to be exposed. As she resumed her knitting, the lavender scarf lengthening, she resolved to visit the shrine again, certain that its shadows held the key to the darkness that had claimed Leonard Bryce. Chapter 8. The Heiress's Poise. The third day at Cresswell Hall brought a fragile reprieve from the rain, with sunlight piercing the clouds to cast a pale glow over the Devon estate. The gardens, still sodden, shimmered faintly, and the cliffs beyond gleamed with damp defiance. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room, a gracious space adorned with gilt-framed portraits and velvet drapes, her knitting needles crafting a delicate shawl in soft rose wool. The fire crackled, its warmth a counterpoint to the lingering chill of Leonard Bryce's murder, which had transformed the house into a crucible of suspicion. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and keen perception, had spent the morning sifting through the threads of the case, the ceremonial dagger, the blonde hair, the smudge on the plinth, the sketch of Astarte's statue, with its tantalizing note about a hidden chamber. Yet it was the human tapestry, woven with secrets and desires, that held her focus. and today she sought to unravel the enigma of Mrs. Cassandra Vane, the heiress whose composure seemed both a shield and a challenge. The drawing-room was quiet, save for the ticking of a mantel clock and the occasional rustle of Miss Marple's wool. The other guests were scattered. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell was with Inspector Craddock in the study, reviewing estate records. Miriam Holt, the pianist, rested in her room, her grief a heavy mantle. Julian Drew, the playwright, lounged in the billiard room, his cynicism undimmed. And Major Hugh Redfern tramped the grounds, his military stride a restless protest against confinement. Miss Marple had requested a private word with Cassandra, sensing that the heiress's poised detachment masked a pivotal truth. The blonde hair found near Leonard's body, Miriam's tale of an argument between Cassandra and Leonard, and Julian's alibi tied to her, all pointed to a woman at the heart of the mystery. Cassandra entered with the grace of a dancer, her tailored navy dress accentuating her willowy frame, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her face, with its high cheekbones and clear blue eyes, was serene. But Miss Marple noted the faint lines of tension at her mouth, the way her hands clasped briefly before relaxing. She took a seat opposite Miss Marple, her posture impeccable, and offered a polite smile. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and melodious, "Lavinia said you wished to speak with me. I'm happy to help, though I'm not sure what I can offer." Her tone was courteous, but there was a guardedness, as though she anticipated a trap. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her smile warm but probing. "You're very kind, Mrs. Vane. I'm only an old woman with a habit of asking questions. But in times like these, every perspective matters. You knew Mr. Bryce well, I understand, through your support of his research. Could you tell me about him? Not the scholar, but the man you saw at Cresswell Hall?" Her question was gentle, inviting confidence, and she watched Cassandra closely, noting the slight tightening of her fingers. Cassandra's gaze flickered to the fire, her voice measured. Leonard was a visionary, driven by his passion for history. I agreed to fund his work on the Astarte shrine, because he believed it could prove a Phoenician presence in Britain. A remarkable claim if true. He was charming, persuasive, but also restless. He wanted fame, not just knowledge, and I sensed that ambition made him reckless. Her words were precise, but Miss Marple caught a note of hesitation, as though Cassandra were choosing each phrase with care. "Reckless how, my dear?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as soothing as a village vicar's. "Did he ever speak of risks, debts perhaps, or disputes?" She thought of Julian's claim that Leonard owed money, and the telephone argument he had overheard, details that suggested financial strain. Cassandra's lips pursed, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's, for a moment before drifting to the window. "He hinted at pressures, yes. He needed more funds than I could provide, and he mentioned other investors, none by name, but he seemed anxious about their expectations. Once, in the library, he told me he'd gone too far with something, but when I pressed, he laughed it off, said it was just scholarly zeal. I didn't believe him." Her admission was reluctant, and Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind seizing on the phrase "gone too far." It echoed the draft letter found in Leonard's desk, with its vague apology, and suggested a man entangled in more than academic pursuits. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice soft. That must have worried you, Mrs. Vane, especially as his patron. I've heard, forgive my indiscretion, that you and Leonard were seen arguing in the library a few nights ago. Was it about his work or something more personal? Her question was bold, but delivered with such disarming mildness that Cassandra's composure faltered, a flush rising to her cheeks. "Who told you that?" Cassandra asked, her voice sharp, then softened as she regained control. "I suppose it was Miriam. Poor thing. Yes, we argued, but it wasn't personal. Leonard was pushing for more money, and I refused. He'd been vague about his progress, and I'm not a fool with my wealth. He was frustrated, said I didn't understand the stakes. I told him to be honest or find another backer. It was heated but brief. Her explanation was plausible, but Miss Marple noted the quick deflection, the way her hand smoothed her dress, a gesture of self-soothing. And after he left the library, Miss Marple pressed, her tone still gentle. Miriam saw you alone, by the fireplace. You seemed shaken, she said. She thought of Miriam's suspicion of an affair, a jealous assumption that might hold a kernel of truth, and watched for Cassandra's reaction. Cassandra's eyes narrowed, but her voice remained steady. Shaken? I was annoyed, nothing more. Leonard could be exasperating, and I needed a moment to collect myself. Miriam must have misread my mood. Grief makes one see shadows. Her words were dismissive, but Miss Marple sensed a crack in her poise, a hint that the argument had touched a deeper nerve. She filed it away, alongside the blonde hair and Julian's alibi, which placed Cassandra in the gardens during the murder's narrow window. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her voice warm. You're right, my dear. Grief distorts things. Let's speak of the ball, then. You were with Mr. Drew after the ceremony, I believe, in the topiary. Can you recall anything unusual? Perhaps someone near the idol house as you returned? Her question was a delicate probe, testing the alibi's strength, and she noted Cassandra's slight pause, as though weighing her response. Cassandra nodded, her composure restored. Julian and I were together, yes, discussing the absurdity of the ritual. We were near the topiary, not far from the shrine, but I didn't see anyone else. The gardens were dark and people were scattered, some heading to the ballroom, others lingering. When we heard Miriam scream, we ran back. With the others, that's all I can tell you. Her account matched Julian's, but its precision struck Miss Marple as rehearsed, and she wondered if the pair had coordinated their stories. The drawing-room door opened, and Major Hugh Redfern strode in, his face ruddy from the cold, his tweed jacket damp from the morning's walk. He paused, seeing Cassandra, and his expression softened, though his eyes held a flicker of unease. Mrs. Vane, Miss Marple, he said, his voice gruff but polite. Craddock's looking for you, Mrs. Vane. Something about a letter in Bryce's room. His gaze lingered on Cassandra, and Miss Marple noted the protective edge, the way his hands flexed, as though restraining an impulse. Cassandra rose, her smile polite but distant. Thank you, Major. Miss Marple, I hope I've been helpful. She glided out, her navy dress a stark contrast to the room's warmth, and Miss Marple's needles resumed, her mind racing. Hugh lingered, his boots scuffing the carpet, and she seized the opportunity, her voice gentle. Major Redfern, you've been out in the air. It does clear the mind, doesn't it? I wonder, did you know Mr. Bryce well, beyond your disagreement over that auction? Hugh's jaw tightened, but he sat, his bulk filling the chair. Not well, no. He was a guest here, and I'm a friend of Lavinia's, so we crossed paths. That auction business left a bad taste. Bryce outbid me for a tablet I'd set my heart on, then had the gall to gloat. But I'm not one to hold grudges. His words were clipped, and Miss Marple noted the lie in his tone, the way his eyes avoided hers. She recalled Julian's account of Hugh's threat to make him pay, a detail that cast his denial in shadow. "And at the ball?" Miss Marple asked, her tone conversational. "You were alone, I believe, lighting a cigar. Did you notice anything odd? Perhaps someone near the idol house?" She thought of his empty scabbard, the size matching the dagger, and watched his reaction. Hugh's face darkened, his voice rising. "I told Craddock I was on the terrace, minding my own business. Didn't see a soul until the scream. Why do you keep poking, Miss Marple? I'm no killer." His defensiveness was palpable, and Miss Marple's smile remained serene, though her mind noted the outburst, a sign of pressure. "I'm sure you're not, Major," she said, her voice soothing. "But small details matter. You were fond of Mrs. Vane, I think. She's a remarkable woman. Did you ever see her with Mr. Bryce in a way that suggested tension?" Her question was a risk, but she sensed Hugh's feelings for Cassandra might loosen his tongue. Hugh's hands clenched, his voice low. "Fond? She's a lady, and I respect her. Bryce was always buzzing around her, talking about his damned shrine. I didn't like it, but it's not my place to interfere. If you're suggesting something improper, you're barking up the wrong tree." His words were fierce, but Miss Marple saw pain beneath the anger. A man protective of a woman who barely acknowledged him. She thanked him, letting him stalk out, and resumed her knitting, the rose shawl lengthening. Cassandra's poise, she mused, was a fortress. But her argument with Leonard, her guardedness, and the blonde hair suggested cracks in the walls. Hugh's protectiveness, Julian's alibi, Miriam's jealousy. These were threads converging on the heiress. Yet the truth remained elusive. Miss Marple thought of the sketch, the hidden chamber, and Leonard's draft letter, each a clue to a motive rooted in ambition or betrayal. She rose, tucking her knitting into her reticule, and made her way to the hall, intending to revisit the idol house. The shrine, with its bronze goddess and cryptic secrets, was more than a crime scene. It was a mirror reflecting the passions that had led to murder. Miss Marple recalled St. Mary Mead, where a whispered confidence or a misplaced letter had unravelled many a mystery. Cresswell Hall was grander, but its dramas were no less human, and she knew that the heiress's poise, like the statue's blank gaze, concealed a truth that would soon come to light. As she stepped into the damp air, the cliffs looming beyond, she resolved to probe deeper, certain that the next clue would bring her closer to the heart of the darkness that had claimed Leonard Bryce. Chapter 9. The Major's Bluster. The fourth morning at Cresswell Hall broke with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the mist to dapple the Devon estate with fleeting gold. The air remained heavy, scented with wet grass and the distant tang of the sea, and the weight of Leonard Bryce's murder pressed upon the house like a physical force. Miss Jane Marple sat in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids, her knitting needles shaping a delicate shawl in pale cream wool. The warmth of the room, with its tiled floor and wicker chairs, contrasted with the chill of suspicion that had deepened among the guests. Miss Marple, her unassuming presence a foil to the estate's grandeur, was piecing together the fragments of the case, the ceremonial dagger, the blonde hair, the smudge on the plinth, the sketch of Astarte's statue hinting at a hidden chamber, and the draft letter of apology found in Leonard's desk. Yet it was the human currents, jealousy, ambition, and unspoken loyalties that drove her inquiry. And today she turned her attention to Major Hugh Redfern, whose bluster masked a complexity she was determined to unravel. The conservatories, humidity curled the edges of a newspaper left on a side table, its headline proclaiming the murder a pagan tragedy. Miss Marple ignored the sensationalism. Her mind focused on the guests' interactions. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell was in the drawing-room, arranging flowers with forced cheer. Miriam Holt, the pianist, remained in her room, her grief a private storm. Julian Drew, the playwright, was in the library, scribbling notes for a play he claimed would outdo this drama. And Mrs. Cassandra Vane, the heiress, walked the cliffs, her solitude a stark contrast to her usual poise. Major Redfern, however, had agreed to meet Miss Marple here, at her request, and she sensed his military bearing and quick temper held clues to the tensions that had culminated in Leonard's death. Hugh entered with a heavy tread, his tweed jacket stretched across broad shoulders, his face ruddy from a morning tramp across the estate. His eyes, a sharp hazel, softened briefly as he greeted her, but his jaw was set, as though bracing for battle. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice gruff but courteous, "you wanted a word. I'm happy to oblige, though I've told Craddock all I know." He sank into a wicker chair, its frame creaking under his weight, and folded his arms, his posture defensive yet oddly vulnerable. Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her smile warm and disarming. "You're very kind, Major Redfern, to humour an old woman's curiosity. I find that men of action, like yourself, often see things others miss. You were a friend of Lavinia's, I understand, and knew Mr. Bryce as a guest here. Could you share your impression of him, not his scholarship, but his character?" Her tone was gentle, inviting candour, and she watched his reaction, noting the way his hands flexed as though gripping an invisible reins. Hugh's brow furrowed, his voice low but forceful. Bryce was a peacock, strutting about with his theories and charm. Thought he was the cleverest man in the room, always talking up that blasted shrine. I didn't trust him. Too smooth, too quick with a smile. Men like that have agendas. His words carried a bitterness that Miss Marple recognised, not just from his auction loss to Leonard, but from a deeper wound. She recalled his empty scabbard at the ball, sized for the dagger that killed Leonard, and his protective demeanour toward Cassandra and Miriam. "Agendas can be dangerous," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as the rustle of leaves outside. "Did you ever see him act in a way that suggested he was in trouble? Perhaps with someone here, or beyond the estate?" She thought of Julian's account of Hugh's threat to make him pay, and the mysterious telephone argument Leonard had, details that pointed to hidden conflicts. Hugh's eyes narrowed, but he leaned back, his tone grudging. "Trouble? He was the sort to court it. I saw him once, a week back, in the village pub, talking to a rough type. Big fellow, scarred face, not local. They were huddled in a corner, and Bryce looked rattled when he left. Didn't mention it, and I didn't ask. None of my business. His words were dismissive, but Miss Marple noted the tension in his voice, the way his fingers drummed on the chair's arm. The scarred man echoed Lavinia's mention of a visitor, and she filed it away, a thread connecting Leonard to an outside threat. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze steady. That's interesting, Major. A man like Mr. Bryce, with his ambitions, might have made enemies. You and he had a disagreement, I believe, over an auction. Was there more to it than a lost tablet? Her question was delicate but pointed, and she saw a flush rise to Hugh's cheeks, his bluster faltering. "Damn that auction," he muttered, his voice rough. It wasn't just the tablet, it was the way he crowed about it, like I was some fool to be outdone. I served in Mesopotamia, Miss Marple, saw ruins older than his books, and he treated me like a novice. But I let it go. I'm not a man to nurse grudges. His denial was vehement, but Miss Marple sensed a lie, not in the words, but in the heat behind them. She recalled Julian's overheard threat, and wondered if Hugh's pride had pushed him further than he admitted. The conservatory door swung open, and a footman entered carrying a tray with a decanter of sherry and 2 glasses. "Mrs. Cresswell's. Compliments, ma'am," he said, setting it down before retreating. Miss Marple poured a small measure for each, her movements precise, and handed Hugh a glass, her smile encouraging. "A little sherry can steady the nerves, Major. Let's talk of the ball, then. You were alone, lighting a cigar, when the scream came. Did you notice anyone near the idol house as you crossed the terrace?" She sipped her sherry, her eyes never leaving his face, and saw a flicker of unease, quickly masked. Hugh took a gulp of sherry, his voice steady but strained. "I was on the terrace, like I told Craddock. The gardens were dark, and I wasn't paying attention to stragglers. I heard the scream, dropped my cigar, and ran to the shrine with the others. That's all there was to it." His account was concise, but Miss Marple noted the omission of details, the way his hand tightened on the glass. She thought of the blonde hair, possibly Cassandra's, and Hugh's protective glances toward her, wondering if he had seen more than he claimed. "You're a soldier, Major," Miss Marple said, her tone conversational, "trained to observe. It's curious that you saw nothing with the idol house so near. I've heard you're fond of Mrs. Vane. Quite natural. She's a remarkable woman. Did you ever notice tension between her and Mr. Bryce, perhaps over their financial arrangement?" Her question was a gentle probe, leveraging his feelings for Cassandra, and she saw his face darken, his bluster returning. "Fond? I respect Mrs. Vane, as any gentleman would," he snapped, setting the glass down with a clink. Bryce was always buzzing around her, talking up his research, but if there was tension, I didn't see it. She's too sensible to be taken in by his sort. "You're fishing, Miss Marple, and I've nothing to hide." His voice was fierce, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt, and Miss Marple's needles resumed, her mind noting the defensiveness, his protectiveness of Cassandra, coupled with his animosity toward Leonard, suggested a motive rooted in more than pride. The conservatory's glass walls reflected the shifting light, and Miss Marple glanced outside, where the idol house stood, its stone dome a silent witness. She decided to press further, her voice soft but insistent. "I'm sure you've nothing to hide, Major, but small details matter. At the ball, your costume, as Ari's, wasn't it, had a scabbard, I noticed. It was empty, which struck me as odd for so fine a piece. Could the dagger have come from it? Perhaps misplaced during the evening. Her question was a risk, but she delivered it with such mild curiosity that Hugh's reaction was unguarded, his face paling before he recovered. "Misplaced? That's nonsense!" he roared, rising to his feet, the chair scraping against the tiles. "The scabbard was part of the costume, nothing more. I never carried a dagger. Why would I? You're grasping at straws, Miss Marple, and I won't stand for it." His anger was palpable, but Miss Marple remained serene, her needles clicking, her eyes calm but piercing. She saw fear beneath his bluster, a man cornered not by guilt, but by the proximity of truth. Before she could respond, the door opened again, and Lavinia appeared, her face pale, a telegram in her hand. "Jane, Hugh, forgive me," she said, her voice trembling. "Craddock's found something. A key in Leonard's pocket, not for any door in the house. He thinks it might belong to the shrine, some hidden lock. He's heading there now." Her eyes darted between them, and Miss Marple's heart quickened, the sketch's note about a hidden chamber flashing in her mind. Hugh seized the distraction, his voice gruff. "A key? Well, that's Craddock's business. I've had enough of this." He stormed out, his boots echoing, and Lavinia sank into a chair, her handkerchief pressed to her lips. "Jane, this is unbearable," she whispered. "A key! A murder! What's next?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her voice soothing. "The truth, Lavinia, always comes next. Thank you for telling me. I'll speak with Craddock later." She gathered her knitting, her mind racing. The key was a new clue, potentially linked to the statue's hidden chamber, and Hugh's reaction to the scabbard question confirmed her suspicions. He was entangled, perhaps not as the killer, but as a man with secrets. She thought of his protectiveness toward Cassandra, his clash with Leonard, and the scarred man in the village, each a thread in the tapestry of motive. Miss Marple excused herself, stepping into the garden, where the air was sharp with the promise of rain. The idle house loomed ahead, its stone walls a cipher for the passions that had erupted within. She recalled St. Mary Mead, where a misplaced key or an overheard quarrel had unravelled many a mystery. Cresswell Hall was grander, but its dramas were no less human, and she knew that the Major's bluster, like the shrine's hidden lock, concealed a truth that would soon be forced open. As she walked toward the house, her shawl drawn tight, she resolved to examine the shrine with Craddock, certain that the key, literal and figurative, would bring her closer to the heart of the darkness that had claimed Leonard Bryce. Chapter 10. The Shrine's Clue. The late afternoon at Cresswell Hall was cloaked in a fragile stillness, the sun having retreated behind a veil of clouds that promised rain over the Devon cliffs. The estate, with its manicured gardens and looming stone walls, seemed to hold its breath, as if aware that the mystery of Leonard Bryce's murder was nearing a critical juncture. Miss Jane Marple, her grey shawl draped over a sensible wool dress, stood alone in the idle house, the circular stone structure that had become the heart of the tragedy. Her knitting bag rested on a nearby bench, but her hands were free, her pale eyes scanning the bronze statue of Astarte, whose outstretched arms and blank gaze presided over the scene of death. The air was damp, scented with moss and the faint tang of salt from the sea, and Miss Marple, with her quiet resolve, felt the weight of the clues she had gathered. The ceremonial dagger, the blonde hair, the smudge on the plinth, the sketch, hinting at a hidden chamber, the draft letter of apology, and now the mysterious key found in Leonard's pocket. Yet it was the human passions, jealousy, pride, and betrayal that drove her to this moment, and she sensed that the shrine itself held a secret that would illuminate the killer's path. The idol house was silent, its stone walls absorbing the faint sounds of the estate, the distant bark of a dog, the murmur of a constable patrolling the grounds. Inspector Craddock had allowed Miss Marple to examine the shrine after his own search, his trust in her sharpened by her uncanny knack for uncovering truths. The key, small and brass with an ornate bow, had puzzled him. It matched no lock in the house, and his theory that it belonged to the shrine had spurred this visit. Miss Marple, guided by the sketch's note about a hidden chamber, was determined to test the idea, her mind alive with the possibilities it suggested. Leonard's obsession with the statue, his secretive behaviour, and the tensions among the guests, Miriam's fear, Julian's cynicism, Cassandra's poise, Hugh's bluster, all converged here in this ancient folly. She approached the statue, its bronze surface pitted by time, its arms raised as if in judgment. The plinth beneath was smooth, save for the smudge she had noted on the night of the murder, now confirmed by Craddock as wax, possibly from a candle held too close. She knelt, her movements careful despite her age, and examined the base where the sketch had indicated a seam. Her fingers traced the stone, finding a faint ridge, almost invisible in the dim light, filtering through the dome's oculus. The seam circled the plinth, suggesting a panel, and she pressed gently, testing for give. Nothing moved, but her pulse quickened. The key, she suspected, was meant for this. Miss Marple stood, her eyes sweeping the chamber. The stone floor bore faint scuff marks, likely from the struggle that had ended Leonard's life. And the table where the chalice had stood was now bare, its contents removed for analysis. She recalled the blonde hair, possibly Cassandra's, and the scratch on Leonard's wrist, signs of a brief but violent encounter. The key, tucked in her reticule alongside the sketch, felt like a talisman, and she resolved to find its lock before the day's end. But first, she needed to understand the shrine's role in Leonard's death, not as a mystical force, as Lavinia's theatricality might suggest, but as a stage for human drama. The crunch of gravel outside announced a visitor, and Miss Marple turned to see Inspector Craddock, his lean frame silhouetted against the doorway. His overcoat was damp, his face etched with the strain of a case that defied easy answers. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice a mix of respect and exasperation. "I should have known you'd beat me here. Found anything, or are you just communing with the goddess?" His tone was light, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the shrine, as if it might yield its secrets under scrutiny. Miss Marple's smile was faint, her voice soft but precise. "Communing, perhaps, Inspector, but with facts, not spirits. This statue is more than it seems. Leonard believed it held a secret, and this key may prove him right. Have you tested the plinth? There's a seam, just there." She pointed, and Craddock knelt, his gloved hands probing the stone, his brow furrowing as he felt the ridge. "You're right," he muttered, rising. "It's a panel, but there's no keyhole. Could be a pressure mechanism, or the keys for something else. A box, maybe, hidden nearby. He glanced at the statue, then at Miss Marple, his expression wary. You think Bryce was killed over this? Some treasure in the shrine? Miss Marple's needles, retrieved from her bag, began their familiar rhythm, the cream shawl lengthening. Not treasure, Inspector, but knowledge. Leonard was obsessed with proving the shrine's Phoenician origins, and knowledge can be as dangerous as gold. Someone here feared what he'd found, or what he'd reveal. Her words were measured, but her mind raced, connecting the key to Leonard's draft letter, his argument with Cassandra, and the scarred man Hugh had seen in the village. Craddock nodded, jotting a note. We're analysing the wax smudge. Could be from a specific candle, maybe one carried that night. And the hair's being tested, though it's likely Mrs. Vane's, given her colour. Any thoughts on the guests? You've been talking to them. I know. His question was direct, and Miss Marple appreciated his candour, though she guarded her own insights, sharing only what served the moment. They're a complex lot, she said, her voice mild. Miss Holt is frightened, not just of loss, but of something she suspects. Mr. Drew knows more than he says, especially about Leonard's debts. Mrs. Vane is too composed, as if she's braced for trouble. And Major Redfern, his anger at Leonard, runs deeper than a lost auction. But it's the shrine, Inspector, that ties them together. Leonard's death here wasn't random. She paused, her eyes on the statue, and Craddock followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. I'll have the plinth examined properly, he said, turning to leave. Stay out of trouble, Miss Marple. This killer's bold, and I'd rather not have you in their sights. His warning was gruff but genuine, and Miss Marple nodded, her smile serene, though her mind was already planning her next move. Alone again, she circled the statue, her fingers brushing the plinth's seam. The key, she suspected, was not for the panel, but for a smaller lock, perhaps within the statue itself. She examined Astarte's base, noting a faint discoloration near the goddess's feet, as if a plate had been removed and replaced. Kneeling again, she pressed the spot, and to her surprise, a small compartment clicked open, revealing a brass keyhole. Her heart quickened, and she retrieved the key, fitting it into the lock with a satisfying turn. The compartment slid wider, exposing a leather pouch, its edges worn but intact. Miss Marple opened the pouch, her movements careful, and found a single item, a locket, silver and engraved with a crescent moon, containing a miniature portrait of Miriam and a folded note in Leonard's hand. The note read, "See, I must end it. Forgive me." The C, she realized, likely stood for Cassandra, confirming Miriam's suspicion of an affair. The locket's presence in the shrine suggested Leonard had hidden it here, perhaps to protect or conceal his intentions. She tucked the pouch into her reticule, her mind racing. The note was a confession. But of what? Love, betrayal, or something darker? The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts, and she rose, slipping the key back into her bag. Lavinia appeared, her face pale, her black dress stark against the shrine's grey stone. "Jane, I saw Craddock leave," she said, her voice trembling. "What are you doing here? It's not safe with a murderer about." Her eyes darted to the statue, and Miss Marple noted the fear in them, not just of the crime, but of the shrine's eerie aura. "Lavinia, dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing, "I'm only looking for answers. This place meant so much to Leonard. Too much, perhaps. Did he ever show you anything he found here? Something he kept secret? She watched Lavinia closely, sensing her hostess knew more than she had shared. Lavinia's hands twisted her handkerchief, her voice low. He was secretive, yes. Once he showed me a rubbing of the statue's carvings, said they were a code, but he wouldn't explain. I thought it was his usual enthusiasm, but now I wonder if it got him killed. Her admission was reluctant, and Miss Marple's needles, resumed in her hands, clicked softly, her mind noting the code as a new lead. They left the shrine together, the sky darkening with the threat of rain. Back in the hall, Miss Marple retired to her room, spreading the locket and note on her dressing table. The portrait of Miriam was recent, her face serene, a stark contrast to her current grief. The note to see suggested Leonard had tried to end an affair, perhaps sparking rage or desperation. She thought of Cassandra's argument with Leonard, Hugh's protectiveness, and Julian's claim of debts, each a motive that could have led to the shrine. The blonde hair, the wax smudge, the key, these were physical clues, but the locket was a window into Leonard's heart, and Miss Marple suspected it held the key to his killer's identity. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. The guests gathered in the dining room under the chandelier's cold light. Miriam, pale but composed, avoided Cassandra's gaze. Julian, his wits subdued, watched the others with a predator's patience. Cassandra, elegant in emerald silk, seemed distant, her poise unshaken. Hugh, his bluster muted, kept his eyes on his plate, though his hand gripped his fork tightly. Lavinia, at the head of the table, tried to maintain decorum, but her voice faltered, and Miss Marple, seated quietly, observed the interplay, her mind weaving the locket's discovery into the tapestry of motives. As the meal ended, Craddock arrived, his face grim. "Miss Marple, a word," he said, drawing her aside. In the hall, he showed her a report. The wax smudge contained traces of a rare lavender-scented candle used in the bull's ceremony. "Only a few were lit," he said, "and Mrs. Cresswell says Mrs. Vane handled one. We're checking her movements." His words confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion of Cassandra's proximity to the crime, but the locket complicated the picture, suggesting a deeper betrayal. Miss Marple nodded, her voice soft. "The shrine holds more, Inspector. Keep looking. At the statue, it's not done speaking." She did not mention the locket, preferring to hold it close until she understood its full significance. As Craddock left, she returned to her room, her knitting resumed, the cream shawl lengthening. The idol house, with its hidden compartment and bronze goddess, was a vault of secrets, and Leonard's death was its price. She thought of St. Mary, Mead, where a hidden trinket or a whispered vow had unravelled many a crime. Cresswell Hall was grander, but its passions were no less raw, and Miss Marple knew that the shrine's clue, like the locket's note, would lead her to the truth that had silenced Leonard Bryce forever. Chapter 11. The Unravelling. The fifth evening at Cresswell Hall descended with a quiet menace, the Devon sky bruised with clouds that swallowed the last of the day's light. The grand drawing-room, its velvet drapes drawn against the gathering, dark, was lit by the soft glow of chandeliers, their crystals casting prismatic flecks across the polished floor. Miss Jane Marple sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, her cream wool shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles idle in her lap. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the unspoken dread that had gripped the house since Leonard Bryce's murder in the Idle House. Tonight, at Miss Marple's request, Inspector Craddock had gathered the guests: Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell, Miriam Holt, Julian Drew, Mrs. Cassandra Vane, and Major Hugh Redfern, for what she termed a clarification of facts. Her unassuming presence belied the razor-sharp mind that had pieced together the clues. The ceremonial dagger, the blonde hair, the wax smudge, the sketch of a hidden chamber, the locket with Miriam's portrait and Leonard's note to Deuseux, and the brass key that had unlocked the shrine's secret. Yet it was the human frailties, jealousy, pride, and unrequited love that had led her to this moment, and she was ready to unravel the truth before Astarte's silent gaze. The guests were seated in a semicircle, their faces a study in strain. Lavinia, in a sombre grey gown, clutched a lace handkerchief, her auburn hair pinned tightly, her eyes darting nervously. Miriam, pale and fragile in a high-necked dress, sat with her hands clasped, her dark eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Julian, his sharp features accentuated by the firelight, lounged with feigned nonchalance, a cigarette unlit between his fingers. Cassandra, regal in deep blue silk, maintained her poise, though her fingers smoothed her skirt with subtle unease. Hugh, his broad frame rigid in a tweed suit, glowered at the floor, his ruddy face set in a scowl. Craddock stood by the mantel, his lean frame alert, his notebook open, his trust in Miss Marple tempered by a policeman's scepticism. The room was silent save for the crackle of the fire and the distant moan of the wind, and Miss Marple, with her gentle voice and piercing gaze, took command. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her tone as mild as if discussing a village fete, "I'm grateful you've indulged an old woman's request to gather here. Murder is a terrible thing, and Mr. Bryce's death in the Idle House has left us all shaken. But the truth, you see, is like a tangled skein of wool. It takes patience to unravel, but the threads always lead somewhere. I believe we can lay this matter to rest tonight." Her words were calm, but the guests stirred, their eyes flicking to one another, suspicion sharpening the air. Craddock cleared his throat, his voice brisk. "Miss Marple has my permission to speak, as she's assisted in past cases. But I'll remind you, this isn't a game. If anyone has information, speak now or to me privately." His gaze swept the room, but no one moved, and Miss Marple nodded, her smile faint but encouraging. "Let's begin with the night of the ball," she said, her hands folding over her shawl. "A splendid affair, full of masks and myths, but also shadows. Mr. Bryce was stabbed in the Idle House moments after the ceremony to Astarte, with a dagger from Lavinia's collection. The act was swift, bold, and planned, for the dagger was taken from the library unnoticed. But why there? And why then? The shrine, you see, was more than a setting, it was a symbol, chosen to mask a very human crime. Her eyes scanned the group, noting Lavinia's bitten lip, Miriam's trembling hands, Julian's tightened jaw, Cassandra's steady gaze, and Hugh's clenched fists. She continued, her voice soft but relentless. "The clues tell a story. A blonde hair likely, Mrs. Vane's was found near the body, suggesting she was close to the scene. A wax smudge on the plinth, from a lavender-scented candle used in the ceremony, points to someone who carried one. Mrs. Vane, again, handled such a candle. The chalice was spilled, the floor scuffed, and Mr. Bryce had a scratch on his wrist, signs of a brief struggle. But the most telling clue was hidden in the statue itself. A locket, with Miss Holt's portrait, and a note from Mr. Bryce. "See, I must end it. Forgive me." She paused, letting the words sink in, and saw Cassandra's face pale, Miriam's eyes widen, and Hugh's scowl deepen. Lavinia's voice broke the silence, high and strained. "A locket? Jane, what does it mean? Was Leonard unfaithful?" Her handkerchief twisted, and Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her focus remained sharp. "It means, Lavinia, that Leonard was a man caught in a web of his own making," Miss Marple said. "Let's consider his life here. He was a scholar, obsessed with the Astarte shrine, believing it held proof of a Phoenician past. He sought funds from Mrs. Vane, who agreed but grew wary of his secrecy. He owed money to Mr. Drew, who was patient, but others may not have been. He clashed with Major Redfern over an auction, wounding his pride. And he loved Miss Holt, yet his heart strayed, causing her pain. The locket's note, addressed to C, suggests he tried to end an affair with Mrs. Vane, a decision that sparked deadly consequences." Her words were measured, and she saw Cassandra's hands clench, her poise cracking. Cassandra's voice was low, controlled. "Miss Marple, you're mistaken. Leonard and I were not lovers. The note must refer to something else. His funding, perhaps. I argued with him about money, as I told you, but nothing more." Her blue eyes met Miss Marple's, defiant but strained, and the older woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle, "but let's trace the night's events." After the ceremony, the guests scattered. Miss Holt was in the rose garden, alone, seeking air. Mr. Drew and Mrs. Vane were in the topiary, discussing the ritual. Major Redfern was on the terrace, lighting a cigar. Lavinia was with a footman, arranging champagne. And Mr. Bryce. He lingered in the idle house, perhaps to hide the locket, a final act of concealment. Someone followed him, took the dagger, and struck. The question is who and why? Her eyes swept the room, and the tension was palpable, each guest a coiled spring. She turned to Miriam, her voice kind but firm. "Miss Holt, you loved Leonard, but you feared he was unfaithful. You saw him with Mrs. Vane, and it broke your heart. When you found him dead, your grief was real. But your time in the garden is unverified. Did you go back to the shrine, perhaps to confront him?" Her question was a gentle accusation, and Miriam gasped, her hands flying to her face. "No, I swear I didn't," Miriam cried, her voice breaking. "I was in the garden crying because he'd sent me away. I only went back when I realized he was gone too long. I found him like that." Her sobs filled the room, and Lavinia moved to comfort her. But Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, noting the sincerity, but also the gap in her alibi. Miss Marple turned to Julian, her tone even. "Mr. Drew, you knew Leonard's debts and his secrets. You were with Mrs. Vane, you say, but your alibi is mutual, and the topiary is close to the shrine. Did you see Leonard, perhaps arguing with someone, and seize a chance to settle a score?" Her question was calm, but Julian's Cigarette snapped in his fingers, his eyes narrowing. "That's absurd," he said, his voice sharp. "I was with Cassandra, as we told Craddock. Leonard owed me money, but I'm not a fool. I wouldn't kill for it. You're spinning tales, Miss Marple." His defiance was brittle, and Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, the way his eyes flicked to Cassandra, as if seeking her support. She turned to Cassandra, her voice soft but piercing. "Mrs. Vane, you funded Leonard's work, but he betrayed your trust, perhaps with more than secrecy. The locket's note suggests he wanted to end something personal. Your candle's wax, your hair, both place you near the crime. Did you follow him to the shrine, angry at his rejection, and act in a moment of passion?" Her accusation was bold, and Cassandra's composure shattered, her voice rising. "How dare you?" she said, standing, her blue eyes blazing. "I was not his lover, and I didn't kill him. Yes, I carried a candle, and my hair might have fallen. I was in the shrine for the ceremony. But I was with Julian afterward, and I had no reason to harm Leonard. You're wrong, Miss Marple." Her words were fierce, but her hands trembled, and Miss Marple saw fear beneath the anger, a woman cornered by circumstance. Finally, Miss Marple turned to Hugh, her voice steady. "Major Redfern, you despised Leonard for his arrogance and his closeness to Mrs. Vane, whom you admire. Your scabbard was empty, sized for the dagger, and you were alone on the terrace, steps from the shrine. The locket's note threatened the woman you care for, and your pride is fierce. Did you confront Leonard, intending only to warn him, and find the dagger in your hand?" Her question was a quiet thunderbolt, and Hugh surged to his feet, his face crimson. "That's a damned lie!" he roared, his fists clenched. "I didn't touch Bryce, and my scabbard was empty because it was a costume, nothing more. I was on the terrace, and I never went near the shrine. You're twisting things, old woman." His rage shook the room, but Miss Marple remained serene, her eyes locking onto his, seeing the desperation beneath the bluster. Craddock stepped forward, his voice sharp. "Enough, Major. Sit down, or I'll have you removed." Hugh sank back, his breathing heavy, and Miss Marple resumed, her voice unshaken. "The truth lies in the shrine," she said, her tone calm but certain. "Leonard hid the locket to end his affair with Mrs. Vane, a decision that enraged someone who loved her. Major Redfern, you were that someone. You saw Leonard's closeness to Cassandra, heard of his betrayal, and when you learned he meant to leave her, your pride and passion snapped. You took the dagger from the library, followed him to the idol house after the ceremony, and stabbed him in a moment of fury. The wax smudge was from your candle, dropped in haste, and the hair was Cassandra's, from when you brushed past her earlier, carrying her scent on your cloak. Your scabbard, empty, was the dagger's home, and your solitude on the terrace gave you the chance to slip away." Her words were a net, closing around Hugh, and the room froze, all eyes on him. Hugh's face drained of colour, his voice a whisper. "No, I didn't." But his shoulders slumped, and he buried his face in his hands, a broken man. Craddock moved swiftly, his voice low. "Major Redfern, I'm taking you in. Anything you say will be used in evidence." He signalled a constable who stepped forward, and Hugh rose, his eyes haunted, offering no resistance. Cassandra's voice cut through the silence, raw with shock. "You did this for me?" Her poise was gone, her face a mask of anguish, and Miss Marple's heart ached, though her resolve held firm. Miriam's sobs resumed, and Lavinia clutched her, her own eyes wet. Julian, his cigarette forgotten, stared at Hugh, his cynicism replaced by disbelief. Miss Marple rose, her shawl slipping, her voice gentle. "Love, you see, can be as deadly as hate. The shrine was a stage, but the motive was human. I'm sorry it came to this." She moved to the door, her work done, leaving Craddock to handle the rest. In her room, Miss Marple sat by the window, the night pressing against the glass. The locket, the key, the shrine's chamber. They had pointed to Hugh, but it was his heart, not Astarte's gaze, that had sealed his fate. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a jealous glance or a hidden vow had unravelled many a crime. Cresswell Hall was grander, but its tragedies were no less intimate, and Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, knew that the truth, once unravelled, brought no joy, only clarity. Chapter 12. Shadows of Astarte. The sixth morning at Cresswell Hall dawned with a deceptive serenity, the Devon sky clearing to reveal a pale sun that gilded the cliffs and cast long shadows across the estate's sodden lawns. The air was crisp, scented with damp earth and the faint brine of the sea. But the tranquillity was a fragile veneer, overlaid with the raw aftermath of Major Hugh Redfern's confession to Leonard Bryce's murder. Miss Jane Marple sat in her guest room, a modest chamber with chintz curtains and a narrow bed, her knitting needles crafting the final rose of a cream wool shawl. The fire in the grate flickered, its warmth a small comfort against the chill of a case resolved, yet heavy with human cost. Her pale eyes, sharp despite her age, gazed out at the gardens where the idol house stood, its stone dome a silent witness to the passions that had erupted within. The clues, the ceremonial dagger, the blonde hair, the wax smudge, the locket with Miriam's portrait, the note to see, the sketch of a hidden chamber, and the brass key had led to Hugh. But it was the unravelling of love's darker shades that lingered in her mind, a tapestry of loss woven in Astarte's shadow. The house was subdued, its usual bustle muted by the weight of truth. Mrs. Lavinia Cresswell, the hostess, had retreated to her private sitting room, overwhelmed by the scandal that had tainted her grand ball. Miriam Holt, Leonard's fiancée, remained in her room. Her grief now mingled with the sting of betrayal. Julian Drew, the playwright, was in the library, his cynicism tempered by the reality of Hugh's downfall. Mrs. Cassandra Vane, the heiress, had taken to the cliffs, her poise shattered by the revelation that Hugh's crime was born of his unrequited devotion to her. Inspector Craddock, his lean frame weary from the case, was preparing to depart, his paperwork complete, though he had promised Miss Marple a final meeting to review her insights. She, with her unassuming air and relentless perception, was packing, her modest suitcase, her work done, yet her thoughts lingered on the human frailties that had turned a mythical revel into a tragedy. Miss Marple rose, smoothing her tweed skirt, and crossed to the window, her gaze settling on the idol house. The shrine, with its bronze goddess and hidden compartment, had been more than a crime scene. It was a mirror reflecting the desires and despairs of those who had stood before it. Hugh's confession, wrung from him in the drawing-room's tense air, had been a catharsis, but it left wounds that would not soon heal. She recalled his broken voice, admitting his love for Cassandra, his rage at Leonard's betrayal, and his impulsive act in the shrine, the dagger a tool of passion rather than calculation. The locket, with its note to C, had been the spark, confirming Leonard's attempt to end his affair with Cassandra, a rejection that Hugh, in his pride and adoration, could not bear. Miss Marple's heart, seasoned by years of village dramas, ached for them all, but her resolve was unshaken. Truth, however painful, was her duty. A knock at the door announced Lavinia, her face pale beneath a simple black hat, her eyes red-rimmed but composed. "Jane, may I come in?" she asked, her voice soft but strained. "I needed to see you before you go. This nightmare has undone me, and I don't know how to thank you." She stepped inside, clutching a silk scarf, her usual theatricality replaced by a raw vulnerability. Miss Marple gestured to a chair, her smile gentle. "Sit, Lavinia dear. You've borne a great deal, and there's no need for thanks. I only did what was necessary, as one does in such times." She resumed her seat, her knitting needles clicking, the shawl nearly complete. "How are you managing, with the house so changed?" Lavinia sank into the chair, her scarf twisting in her hands. "Barely, Jane. The guests are leaving, the police are packing up, and I'm left with this stain. I thought the ball would be a triumph, a night of magic, but it's brought nothing but sorrow. I keep seeing Hugh's face, so broken, and Cassandra. She's like a ghost, walking the cliffs alone. Did I cause this, inviting them all here?" Her voice trembled, and Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her mind remained clear. "You invited friends, Lavinia, not fate," she said, her voice steady. "People carry their burdens, and sometimes they clash in ways no one can foresee. The Idle House was a stage, but the drama was theirs. Leonard's ambition, Cassandra's allure, Hugh's devotion. You mustn't blame yourself." Her words were kind but firm, and Lavinia nodded, though her eyes remained haunted. They sat in silence for a moment, the fire's crackle a counterpoint to the wind's low moan. Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to the locket, now in Craddock's possession, its note a testament to Leonard's divided heart. She recalled Miriam's pain, learning of his affair, and Cassandra's denial, her poise crumbling under the weight of Hugh's act. Julian's cynicism had shielded him, but even he had been shaken, his sharp wit dulled by the reality of murder. The shrine, with its hidden chamber, had been Leonard's obsession, but it was the human connections, fragile, fraught, and fatal, that had driven the dagger. Lavinia's voice broke her reverie, hesitant but curious. "Jane, how did you know it was Hugh? The clues, yes, but there was something else. Something in the way you saw them all. I don't understand it." Her eyes searched Miss Marple's, seeking the secret of her clarity, and the older woman smiled, her needles pausing. "It's no magic, Lavinia," she said, her tone mild. "I watch people, you see, as I do in my village. A glance, a hesitation, a word left unsaid, these tell stories. Hugh's love for Cassandra was plain, though he hid it behind bluster. His anger at Leonard, his empty scabbard, his solitude at the ball, they were threads. but it was his heart that wove them together. The locket showed Leonard's betrayal, and Hugh's pride couldn't bear it. It's always the heart in the end. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of years spent unravelling human nature. And Lavinia's eyes widened, a mix of awe and sorrow. Before Lavinia could respond, a tap at the door heralded Craddock, his overcoat buttoned, a briefcase in hand. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Cresswell," he said, his voice brisk but warm. "I'm off to the station, but I wanted a word. Redfern's been charged, and the evidence is solid. The dagger, the wax, the locket. You've done us a service, Miss Marple, though I'll never understand how you see what I miss." His tone was grudgingly admiring, and Miss Marple's smile was self-deprecating, her hands folding over her knitting. "You're too kind, Inspector," she said, rising. "You'd have found the truth, with or without me. The shrine gave up, its secret and the rest followed. But tell me, what of the key? Did the statue yield anything more?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were keen, recalling the hidden compartment and its leather pouch. Craddock nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We searched again, with a locksmith. The panel you found had no other locks, but we found carvings. Inside, Phoenician, the expert says, confirming Bryce's theory. No treasure, but a scholar's gold. Redfern didn't care about that, though. His motive was personal, as you said." He paused, then added, "Miss Holt's leaving tomorrow, and Mrs. Vane's booked a passage to France. They'll need time, I reckon." Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the idol house loomed. "Time, yes, and peace, if they can find it. Thank you, Inspector. Safe travels." Craddock tipped his hat and left, his footsteps fading, down the corridor, and Lavinia rose, her scarf now a crumpled knot. "I'll let you pack, Jane," she said, her voice steadier. "But promise you'll visit again, when this is a memory. I need a friend like you." Her smile was tentative, and Miss Marple nodded, her heart warmed by the plea, though she knew Cresswell Hall would never be the same. Alone, Miss Marple resumed packing, folding her woolens with care, her knitting tucked into her bag. The shawl, nearly finished, would go to a St. Mary Mead widow, a small act of kindness to balance the darkness she had faced. She thought of the guests, each marked, by the tragedy, Miriam, mourning a love tainted by infidelity, Cassandra, haunted by a devotion she hadn't sought, Julian, his cynicism a shield against guilt, Lavinia, her hospitality forever shadowed, and Hugh, his life undone by a moment's rage, a soldier felled not by war, but by love. The idol house, with its bronze goddess, had been their crucible, its shadows revealing truths they could not escape. She crossed to the desk, where a single sheet of paper lay, a note she had written to herself. Astarte sees all. It was Leonard's phrase, found in his sketches, and it echoed in her mind, not as a mystical claim, but as a reminder of human transparency. She tucked the note away, her thoughts turning to St. Mary Mead, where simpler dramas, stolen silver, whispered scandals, awaited her. Cresswell Hall was grander, its stakes higher, but the heart's follies were universal, and Miss Marple, with her quiet wisdom, had navigated them once more. A final knock came, and Miriam appeared, her face pale but composed, a small suitcase in hand. "Miss Marple, I'm leaving for London," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I wanted to thank you. You found the truth, even if it hurt. I'll try to move on." Her dark eyes held a flicker of resilience, and Miss Marple's smile was warm, her hand reaching out to clasp Miriam's. "You're stronger than you know, my dear," she said, her voice gentle. "The heart heals in time, and you'll find your music again. Safe journey." Miriam nodded, a tear escaping, and left, her footsteps a faint echo of hope amidst sorrow. Miss Marple finished packing, her suitcase snapped shut, and took a last look at the room. The fire had dwindled, its embers glowing faintly, and she felt a pang of weariness, not for the case, but for the pain it had exposed. She thought of Astarte, the goddess of love and war, whose shrine had framed this tragedy. The statue's blank eyes had seen nothing, but the human eyes around it, Hugh's, Cassandra's, Miriam's, had seen too much, their visions clouded by desire and despair. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, picked up her bag, and stepped into the hall where a footman waited to carry her case to the car. The drive to the station was silent, the cliffs slipping past in a blur of green and grey. Miss Marple's thoughts lingered on the shrine, its hidden chamber a metaphor for the secrets people buried. She recalled a St. Mary Mead widow, driven to theft by a lover's betrayal, and saw the same pattern here, magnified by wealth and ambition. Hugh's act, born of love for Cassandra, was no less human, no less tragic, and Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, felt the weight of that truth as she boarded the train. The carriage was quiet, its other passengers lost in their own worlds, and Miss Marple settled by the window, her needles resuming their work. The cream shawl was complete, its edges neat, a small triumph against the chaos she had left behind. As the train rattled towards St. Mary Mead, she gazed at the passing fields, their simplicity a balm after Cresswell Hall's grandeur. The shadows of Astarte, she knew, were not the goddesses, but those of the hearts that had stood before her. And Miss Marple, with her gentle clarity, had brought them into the light. The train's whistle sounded, a mournful note, and she closed, her eyes ready for home, where new stories, no less human, awaited her unravelling.